Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. Today, I'm delighted to talk to Abdullah al Andalusi. You're most welcome, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you. Great to be back again.
Yep, it's great to have you on the channel, I must say. For those who don't know, Abdullah is an international speaker, thinker, and an intellectual activist for Islam and Muslim affairs. He's a researcher for the I3 Institute, an instructor and head of the Department of Occidentology at the Quran Institute, and co-founder of the discussion forum, the Muslim Debate Initiative. For 20 years, his work has been in explaining and demonstrating the intellectual proofs for the Islamic belief system, promoting the Islamic way of life and Islamic solutions for contemporary problems, and advocating for the rights of Muslims across the world. He's taught a number of courses and given a variety of lectures at universities and colleges internationally. But he is better known for his numerous TV appearances and public debates. Most recently, of course, his appearance on the Piers Morgan show. We can watch it on YouTube. Abdullah will be going through today a concise summary of the history of Palestine and Israel in order to give people a basic understanding of the history and a foundation for further reading, research, and advocacy for Palestine. And this is part one of two parts. The second part, where he'll be looking in more detail at the top 10 Zionist arguments and responses to criticisms. And he'll be going through each of those in some details. This is a foundational video, the first part. The second part, he'll be going into the Zionist arguments. So you really need to look at both parts to get the whole story. So in addition to working from scholarly research, Abdullah will approach the subject from a critical debater's eye. So that's my introduction. But my first question really is, can I just ask, first of all, how did you first get into refuting Zionism and advocating for Palestinian rights?
Yeah, well, thank you for the introduction. Basically, I've done a number of debates and lectures on a variety of topics over the many years, decades, dare I say. And many people obviously have probably seen my lectures and debates on atheism, my early ones on Christianity back in the day, and various debates with liberals and so on and so forth. But a lesser known secret is that my first ever lecture that I gave in a more academic setting was on the topic of Palestine and Israel in 2008. I was invited to a college in London, and actually the majority of the students were Jewish, and they were very fascinated to hear an alternative viewpoint. And many of them agreed. In fact, the only one I remember who actually vigorously disagreed was a Polish non-Jew. He was not Jewish individual, but came from a conservative family, right-wing family, linked to the British establishment. And he was vigorously arguing with me during the discussion, whereas many of the students were very attentive to what I was saying and asked questions. And we had a very good back and forth. And actually, they pretty much accepted the points. So this was in 2008. There's a video somewhere. If I find it, I might, upload it and so on. But this is from in the archives.
In the archives. Okay.
So that's all. As far back as 2008, I went public with those kinds of discussions. But most people request me to do usually other topics, and it was only in light of the 2021 kind of bombardment of Gaza where I was asked to reprise my role in speaking about Gaza and the Palestinians in an academic setting again, and do a course on it, kind of using all my, I would say, 2 decades of research in it to kind of, educate Muslims with the tools they need in order to advocate for Palestine and refute Zionist arguments.
I certainly think you're one of the most educated, informed people on the subject around, I must say. So, well, thank you for that. You've produced some slides. Here's the first one, I think.
Yes. So basically, it's just everyone kind of sees the image, the famous image of Palestine with ever decreasing areas of what you might call Palestinian sovereignty, although technically speaking, they don't have sovereignty even over those areas that you see on the far right there in green. But it's a typical image. The question that I think many people have, and many people don't necessarily ask, is how did we get to the image we see on the right? And how did it start from what was on the left and go to what's on the right? And what is the actual condition of Palestinians that they're in, even in that image on the right? And these are kind of questions which are very important. I know people might think, well, it's not relevant to look at history because shouldn't we deal with facts on the ground now? But in a sense, a lot of the disputes are, you could say, disputes over property and land. And anyone who has property knows that if you don't have historical documents showing that the property belongs to you, i.e., like, for example, a deed or what have you, then people can deny your ownership of it. In fact, a lot of historical debates and discussions are over property rights and over native rights and so on and so forth. And so we're forced to go back into history and to work out what happened, what were the injustices that were committed, in order to inform our solutions today. So really, I wanted to kind of equip everybody with a quick, you could say, well, let's say quick, relatively speaking, an A to Z of what happened since the British invasion, or just a bit before the British invasion of Palestine in the previous century, until now, so that they can make sense of all the kind of terms and treaties that are thrown about, and the events in the past that are referred to by both pro-Palestinian activists, academics, as well as Zionist activists and polemicists.
Okay.
So let's get started. So, okay, a brief history of Zionism. Now, Zionism actually is a little more complicated than most people imagine. Theodor Herzl never invented Zionism. The idea of Zionism goes back actually a few centuries before, maybe to, or I suppose you could say till about the 18th to 19th century, with Christians or Europeans who talked about, not non-Jews, who talked about bringing the Jews back to the land of Palestine. This was an era of nationalism, an era of the idea that every ethnicity in the world should have a place for them, that is a nation state that represents their culture and ethnic group. I could go into that, like, for example, Napoleon Bonaparte was actually, when he was, conquering Egypt, after he conquered Egypt and he was moving into Palestine, he wasn't successful in conquering Palestine. He was pushed back, but he was one of the first people that came up with the idea, or the declaration. He wanted to make a declaration to invite Jews to come back to Palestine, quote unquote. So this idea of Zionism ironically starts with non-Jews, and a lot of these are Christian, you could say Christian Zionists.
Yeah.
But Theodor Herzl is renowned for really giving Zionism its political success, and kind of sharpening its vision. So Theodor Herzl is not a religious Jew. He doesn't believe in God. He's an atheist.
Yeah.
He thinks the Bible is full of fables and stories. He doesn't really, there might be some history to it, but he isn't really concerned so much with the literal truth of the Old Testament or the Tanakh. He's concerned with the legend of it and how it forms a cultural ethos for Jews. So he basically wrote a number of works on what you might call the Jewish question, where he was concerned about Jewish minority rights in Europe. The pogroms.
I was confused when I hear this term, the Jewish question. What is the question? Seriously, what is the question that this is summarizing in like 3 words? I don't get it. I mean, is it like, what do we do with the Jews? Is that what it means? What's the subtext or the fuller meaning of that phrase?
Well, it's a typically, you could say, European phrase at the time, which was whenever there was ethnic tensions or issues, they would raise a question. So the Ottomans faced, the Balkans questions on a number of its territories, and then eventually that was used to support these territories to secede from the Ottoman Caliphate. Of course, we see that many anti-Semitic Europeans were talking about Jews being a minority that didn't integrate, that had different customs and culture, and they were raising the issue of the Jewish question. And Theodor Herzl, in a sense, agreed to a degree, not with their anti-Semitism, but rather with the question as to whether Jews could truly be accepted into Europe. And
yes,
whether
the Jewish question means like the Jewish problem. So I'm just trying to phrase this in a way that is different phrasing. So these anti-Semitic Europeans, like obviously Hitler in Mein Kampf, you know, he's problematizing the Jews as something to be dealt with. So the Jewish question is the Jewish problem. What do we do with these people? And so his solution was obviously a very hostile one, but Theodor Herzl's one was more positive, to find somewhere it was feasible in the world, somewhere where they could actually live without being persecuted, I guess. Would that be?
Yes, in a sense, some people might say he was playing up to anti-Semites, making the argument to them that it's in their interest. If they feel that there's a Jewish problem, they should support Jews finding a nation state elsewhere for themselves, where they have sovereignty for themselves. And so he wrote the book, the Judenstaat. It was in 1896, which was where he laid out the idea that the only way that Jews could ever be respected in the world is if they have a state for themselves, because without the state, they're viewed as kind of stateless, kind of a problem, quote unquote, from the perspective of those who, well, he's mostly talking about the European context. They're almost like vagrants. They're just stateless individuals that kind of live in different European countries, and they can never truly be part of the European country. So he was arguing that kind of angle to both get support from, ironically, anti-Semites. They say, look, if you want to solve the Jewish problem, you know, you should support us getting a nation state for ourselves.
Yeah.
And but at the time, even in that book, he hadn't settled on the idea of whether it would be Palestine. For him, it was acceptable to be in any decent country that could accept kind of settlement and could be relatively financially viable. Argentina was mentioned in that book as an alternative, as well as Palestine. And they each had pros and cons, and he kind of discussed them, but he didn't settle on any decision. He left that for a decision of kind of Zionist, fellow Zionists to kind of discuss and come to a conclusion over. Now, what he truly is famous for is for founding the Zionist Congress, the World Zionist Congress, which is interesting because at the time there was a difference of opinion amongst Jews across the globe. Jews in North America, many of them who adopted a liberal program and paradigm, even publicly renounced the idea of having a Mosaic or a Jewish state in the sense of a religious sense. And they said that they're happy to be Americans and they have all their rights after the emancipation of the Jews that came with the Enlightenment and with states implementing Enlightenment ideals. But what he does is, though he doesn't have a particular solution in mind, what he does, his stroke of genius, you could say, it was to just create a talking shop for different kind of Jewish movements and ideas. People had ideas of Zionism which were different to what you might imagine, like cultural Zionism, the idea that they want to create a modern identity for Jews, which kind of solidifies a type of Jewish cultural feeling across the world, to prevent assimilationism from removing, Jewish culturalness, what have you. Rather than a state, they didn't really look at a state per se, but he brought all these different people on board to a talking shop and say, what solutions can we find to the problem of persecution of Jews in Europe, basically. And I say in Europe because whenever he talks about the Middle East, and especially when he talks about the Muslim world and the Ottoman Caliphate, he actually praises them for their treatment of Jews, that they tend to be tolerant and they don't have the kind of problems. But he's a European Jew and his context is Europe. So, and of course, the majority of Jews in the world were European Jews or Western Jews, because those were living in North America, but from European extraction, Ashkenazi Jews, as they're called. That was the situation they faced: anti-Semitism, discrimination and bigotry. And of course, these were, a really significant phenomena at the time. Most people don't fully appreciate. And this is before, this is like 50 years before, Hitler and German Nazis and so on and so forth. Anti-Semitism was a long-standing problem in the West. So anyway, creates the Zionist organization.
I want to say that you're right. Just to stress what you just said, it was a phenomenon in the West, but it was a Western issue. It's a Western virus, if you like. It didn't come from the Muslim world. It's not an Islamic issue, but Muslims and Christians and Jews coexisted peacefully for centuries in the Ottoman Empire under Islamic rule. Of course, that's very well documented and not disputed. It is particularly European/Western virus that was agitating this. It wasn't. There's nowhere else in the world there this is a problem.
Yes, indeed. Now I want to caveat, because I'm quite pedantic, which is yes, there were situations in 1,300 years of Islamic history where you had sometimes there was communal tensions in some areas of a very vast Islamic world. And so if you want to pick where sometimes there was resentment because many Muslims might have been poor in certain situations and circumstances, and they resented the Jewish community, having a lot of wealth, which they were having light taxes, they were wealthy, they were enjoying very good lifestyles within Islamic rule. But I want to always stress that you'll never find, apart from one case of a heretical Muslim sect, but you'll never find state-sanctioned pogroms or persecution of Jews in Islamic history. Generally, that is unheard of. And in fact, whenever there was a breach of Jewish rights that occurred, the Muslim authorities were usually quite severe and harsh on the perpetrators who breached the contract of dhimma. The contract of, dhimma means a covenant, I suppose, the contract covenant between a non-Muslim community of the book, people of the book, and Muslims. So when that covenant has been violated by any Muslim, the authorities tend to be quite harsh on the Muslim violators for breaking the covenant of protection to their non-Muslim, kind of neighbors and so on and so forth. So anyway, I just want to give that little caveat.
If I can clarify that, it's a fascinating contrast. I think people in the West don't often realize this, but yeah, thank you.
So in this Congress, in this talking shop, as they begin to start to settle on the idea of maybe Palestine being a place, but also Argentina, they need a place to pool funding, and so they need to develop funding mechanisms that the Congress could actually direct. So one of these institutions they set up is the Jewish National Fund at the 5th Zionist Congress. But what you also see is that they also will set up I'll just pick it out for you. Sorry, also the Jewish Colonial Trust here, which is the first Zionist bank that was created. I often point it out because many Zionists will argue that. They say, "Oh, we're not colonial settlers. Zionism isn't settler colonialism," and yet
called the first Jewish colonial bank. I mean, or trust.
Yeah,
it's even called that. So as a hint.
Was it looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck. It introduces itself as a duck.
It walks like a duck and swims like a duck. It probably is a duck.
Yes.
Despite anyone else saying it's not a duck.
Not a duck, yeah. Now, at this time, the Zionists were open about what they were doing, which is they're going to settle an area, and it's going to create a colony. They're going to colonialize, take over a land, and populate it with ideally a Jewish majority, such that it can become a Jewish state. So a democracy. But democracy requires a majority. If you want to declare democracy to be representing an ethno-nationalist state of one particular ethnicity. So this is where the ideas develop that, well, what we need to create as Zionists is a Jewish majority in a piece of land which we will have sovereignty over, and make it into a democracy. And this is where they at the first ever Zionist Congress, they adopted the Basel program, which basically aims of establishing for Jewish people a state. And this is where they settle on the idea of it will be in Palestine. Whereas previously they had looked at other options, including Argentina and other places. There was even options considered to be in North America too, in America itself, United States of America, to be more exact.
That would have been interesting, yeah. Gosh.
But that never panned out. America is always fully supportive of a homeland for Jews, except in its own territories, of course.
It's very, very generous of them to say that. Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, this is where Theodor Herzl declares that the Basel program was at that time. He'd said, "I founded the Jewish state." He felt like this kind of agreement was arrived at, that it will be Palestine. This was where the Jewish state had been founded, and he said that maybe in 5 years, maybe certainly in 50 years, and you'll see this. And rather eerily, it was 50 years from that point in time that the United Nations will declare the partition of Palestine for a Jewish state. So that's quite eerie, actually. Okay. So their plan was this: at this juncture, the Ottoman Caliphate controlled Palestine. So what was their plans? They're not going to make an invasion force because they don't have an army and the Ottomans are there. So initially,
just to confirm, so this was a Muslim controlled, Muslim ruled area, part of the Ottoman Empire, where Christians and Jews and Muslims, of course, peacefully lived together at that time. There was no ethnic cleansings, no attacks on Palestinians, obviously. It was a very different, peaceful, dare one say it, civilized civilization at that time. I just stress this because the contrast to what's literally going on as we speak couldn't be greater. Now we have literally an ethnic cleansing, the entire destruction of the Gaza area, flattened. We've all seen the terrible pictures, as if it reminds me of Dresden or Berlin during the Second World War, where the RAF and others literally deliberately flattened the whole city. That's the only historical comparison I can think of, and that's happening now. Extraordinary contrast between Muslim rule and what's happening today, to my view.
Oh yes, and inshallah we'll go more into that when you'll see that. I mean, okay, it's not in the presentation, but in part 2 you might see.
Okay.
I will mention that actually even early Zionists like Ben Gurion, who would later become the prime minister of the first prime minister of the State of Israel, actually praised and marveled at the Ottoman system of how it would maintain peace between different ethnic groups and communities, and how it would have this autonomy granted to all these different communities. And at this early juncture, the Zionists didn't know exactly how they would get sovereignty in Palestine. But the first step was they would need to send Jews to Palestine and begin populating it and getting a significant majority in that land. So they began making purchases of land and settling Jews from East Europe, from Russia, where they were facing pogroms, into Palestine. Now, okay, Ottomans caught wind of this, of a political project, and they had already faced problems with the Balkans when there was secession based on this new fangled thing called nationalism. So they did try to limit immigration into Palestine, but they said to any Jews escaping persecution, you're welcome to go to any part of the Ottoman lands, but not to concentrate in Palestine. And because, as I said, they were worried that it would then create a potential secessionist conflict, and they were having trouble trying to maintain the integrity of the caliphate as it was, due to all the kind of foreign powers scheming and planning and plotting against it. Anyway, so initially there was immigration. Immigration actually came in 2 waves during Ottoman times, purchasing land and settling. So they found ways around the Ottoman bloc. They just go into the Ottoman lands in Turkey, what have you, then just move and just walk to Palestine, because there's not like there's going to be internal borders or checkpoints. Like this.
Yeah.
The Ottomans really didn't monitor or do anything really to stop it. But what we see is kind of prior to now, World War I really kicking off. We see the British did an ethnographical map of the areas of Palestine to look at really what was the lands of the Muslim world and so on and so forth, to map them out. And this is where we get some information about where the Jewish communities were located at this point in time. Now, this is not just areas where there was obviously Jewish communities from before the recent immigrations, because they were Palestinian, we call them Palestinian Jews, or they're called Palestinian Jews, those who lived in the land with the fellow Palestinians for centuries. This was also, this map includes now the recent communities, the recent communes that were set up from East European Jews and so on and so forth to settle. They were settled in only these few areas here. You see 7 kind of major areas here. And at that time, even despite there was 2 waves of immigration, the Jews only represented 6% of the total population of the area of Palestine at that time. Now, World War I obviously kicks off, and the British know that in order to defeat the Ottomans, they need a little help, and they need help from any angle or place they can get it from. One of the people that they solicited are the Arabs of Arabia, more specifically Sharif Hussein, who was controlling the areas of Makkah and Medina, and they asked him to revolt against the Ottomans. In return, they promised him, and we'll get to that in a second, but they promised him that once they've defeated the Ottomans, they could maybe create a Arab Caliphate and give sovereignty of the lands, quote unquote, back to Arabs. So they used racial or ethnic incentives, which is obviously, as you know, is outside the ken of the Muslim mindset. Ideally, of course.
So just T.E. Lawrence, of course, is Lawrence of Arabia, famously, and that's how he's usually known. And there's an amazing film made of him, which won lots of Oscars. Actually, really worth watching. It's an extremely amazing film, even though Lawrence of Arabia is the hero in that. And of course, for many Muslims, obviously, he's not a hero because he conspired to destroy the Ottoman Empire.
Oh yes, and as I said, he was fully aware of what he wanted to do. As you can see here, he describes that the Arab revolt, which they are fomenting, so he's a British agent that's sent to work with the Arabs or Sharif Hussein's rebellion, to be more precise, that it will be beneficial for them to break up the Islamic bloc. So that was the purpose, was to break up the Islamic bloc to disrupt the Ottoman Empire, and also because the new states that they were going to create, and it wasn't going to be this one continuous state that Sharif Hussein might have imagined the British would give him, but rather they were going to create a number of, as it were, called a political mosaic of multiple factions, multiple smaller states that would be, jealous principalities incapable of cohesion.
Wow. So
they would be focusing on their own power, their own interests, and they would be incapable of unity. So the Muslim or the Islamic bloc be broken up into smaller, weaker states which only care about themselves. And it's quite sad that this is exactly what happened. But it should be important for Muslims to know that this was always the intention behind, you could say, Western designs in the region, was to break up the unified bloc and make smaller, easy to manipulate, easier to control, was it jealous principalities? Well, anyway,
we don't go to modern politics, but one could argue that we see that precisely that in the world today in these tiny states.
They were quite successful.
Yeah. Okay,
so this was the promise that was given, you could say, to Sharif Hussein. So it's called the Mahon Hussein Correspondence. after Colonel Sir Henry McMahon, who was the British High Commissioner to Egypt. So the offer to Sharif Hussein was, and this was in letters and correspondences between 1915 and 1916, that in return for Arab support, the British would gift him all of those territories that you see there.
Wow.
As to whether the British were really going to do so is a different question. We certainly know that the British funding of the Saudis and giving them weapons and so on and so forth indicated that they weren't going to give Sharif Hussein everything, because that includes Saudi-controlled territories. But
the lesson here, this is a lesson that the world has learned the hard way, the Muslim world anyway, is how duplicitous the British were, promising various people contradictory things to further the Britain's own perceived self-interest. But the lying and deception and duplicity is something that is a great blot on Britain's history. It's a great shame and a great scandal, and it's still reverberating today in the mistrust between Britain and the rest of the world because of the way we behaved when we had power. I mean, real power, not like now. Yeah.
I mean, the reason I bring this up, and it's not irrelevant to the discussion about Palestine and Israel, is because the argument presented by Zionists is that the Balfour Declaration is a legal document, a legal agreement that Britain must honor and therefore give them a national homeland in Palestine. But if you really want to go by legal agreements, this legal agreement, well, there's an argument. They're trying to say it's not legal, but it's an agreement between the British government or representatives of the British government and Sharif Hussein. This would also count as a document that would be considered in a legal context as a promise by the British to give Sharif Hussein all that land. As you can see, there's no separate part of, Palestine hasn't been excluded from that, but included there. Only the blue bit was denied Sharif Hussein because that was promised to the French.
Right, the French. Okay.
Right. All right. So very kind of quick summary of what happened. So January 1915, the Ottomans actually begin an offensive to take Sinai, which was nominally under British control, and to block the Suez Canal as part of the war effort. They had some success going up to Romani, which is on the orange cross on the left there, and they held it for some time. But then the Arab revolt begins in June 1916, which diverts a significant amount of Ottoman troops to the Hijaz just to deal with their hit-and-run attacks, their guerrilla warfare, and so on and so forth. So this then leads Ottoman armies to be weakened, and by August 1916, Allies score their first kind of counterattack victory against the Ottomans, begin to push the Ottomans back from the Suez Canal and eventually to Gaza. And we see that in between the British hadn't yet conquered Palestine yet. They hadn't yet taken over Jerusalem or taken over the areas that would now be the mandate of Palestine. But during this time, we see that this was kind of coordinated by Lord Walter Rothschild, who's was a very, very rich family. If anyone's heard of the Rothschilds, they're quite well known. Coordinated by the Rothschilds, two Zionist negotiators, Chaim Weizmann, who would have played a pivotal role in Zionist politics and the State of Israel later on, as well as Nahum Sokolov, both negotiate with Britain, Lord Arthur Balfour, to, in return for a number of benefits, the British would support Jewish claim to the land of Palestine once the British took it. So the British hadn't even taken it yet. We're already promising it to create a. Now, here's the issue: a Jewish national home, but it didn't say a Jewish state, and this would be an area of contention later on. So always pay attention to the precise use of wording in British diplomatic communications.
Especially this, as has been described as a legal document, obviously the wording is absolutely crucial.
Yes, as we'll see, this becomes the basis for the San Remo conference, which we'll get to in a second. San Remo conference, sorry. So we see then now after this, the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour has been made, and the Balfour Declaration is something which caused some consternation amongst some of the Arabs who had been revolting against the Ottomans. But was kind of waved away. So although you have to worry about that, we'll deal with all this once we've won the war. That they're kind of placated to some extent, despite the fact that they were like quite concerned. Oh, wait a second, we're going to have negotiations or what? So General Allenby defeats the Ottomans in November 1917. He enters Jerusalem on the 11th of December 1917. We see on that map that the British advance on the left, and on the right you see the Arab forces from the Hijaz fighting the Ottomans from behind and attacking their supplies and so on and so forth. So they were hit for two fronts, and the Ottomans had no chance from being attacked from those two directions, even though they quite heroically held off the British, who actually had a numerical superiority against the Ottomans in this region, maybe 3-1. Perhaps. So the Ottomans are actually quite heroic, but they couldn't face being hit on two fronts. After Jerusalem fell in December 1917, we see that the Ottomans in October 1918 eventually sued for peace and withdrew from the region. So that's there. Okay. Now we're going to fast forward a little bit. This is after World War I, picking up the pieces. The San Remo conference is convened by principal Allied powers. Somehow Japan's included. That was considered to be a world power at the time as well. And they agreed to implement the mandate of Palestine according to the agreement set out in the Balfour Declaration. Now, this is where the Balfour Declaration gets more formal legal recognition, because it enters into as part of the official mandate of Palestine agreed by the League of Nations, now the newly created League of Nations, supposedly an organization which is a predecessor to the United Nations, to create world peace and prevent wars, disastrous wars from reoccurring. And of course, we all know how successful that was.
Yeah, not very.
Now, again, the reason why I mentioned San Remo Conference and of course the mandate of Palestine is that legal document and also the Charter of the League of Nations, this will be used later on from both sides, both the pro-Palestinians and Zionists, and even today it's used today in legal discussions. I won't go into that because we'll save that for the next the second part. But it's an important document which the Zionists relied on to argue that they have a right to the land of Palestine. But Palestinians argued in response that, well, actually, the document specifies the right to self-determination of the peoples there, and they are denied that right in Palestine. So, but we'll get to that discussion in another part, the second part, inshallah. Okay, what most people don't realize is that the mandate of Palestine, so basically after the British took over Ottoman lands, they created mandates in different regions. This is when they created these new countries that didn't exist before as a separate, as nation states or what have you. We had Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. So French were in control of Lebanon and Syria as mandates. British were in control of Iraq. The mandate of Palestine was actually everything you see here. I don't know if you can see my mouse cursor. Can you see my mouse cursor? Or
No, it doesn't.
Okay. No. There I was like circling with my mouse cursor for this time. That's like,
oh, really? No, we can't see it, unfortunately. At least
okay. Well, anyway, just imagine a mouse cursor.
An imaginary mouse. Oh dear. Okay.
Yeah. So it's actually both Jordan and Palestine. And at the time, Jordan was called Transjordan. But now this is the reason why I mentioned this is actually quite important, is that the mandate of Palestine was always actually this entire area. It was only a special memo by the British government that decided to award Transjordan to that the right part, the east side of the mandate of Palestine to the Hashemites, that it decided to make an exception. So it made a formalized exception to the League of Nations. It was accepted that while the whole area is still called the Mandate of Palestine and will be called the Mandate of Palestine, still continuing until its termination of the mandate, the east side would be exempted from it being used to be the creation, the area that upon which we created the national home for Jews. So Transjordan will be exempted from that promise, which was accepted. Now, Zionists protested this, saying, "No, we want this. This is the whole land. It's like this is the whole mandate of Palestine. It should apply to the whole mandate of Palestine." And some Zionists today will still argue that the east bank of the Jordan River, which is just west of Amman, is actually was promised to them and belongs to them, and they want to see that given to the state of Israel.
I was literally just there a couple of months ago, standing on the east side in Jordan, on the River Jordan, and interesting, in Amman where I stayed, you can actually see Jerusalem at night. You can see the lights of Jerusalem at night on the horizon. It's about 40 kilometers away, so it's actually very close to, yeah.
Okay. At the Treaty of Lausanne, the dissolution of the Ottoman Caliphate occurs, and all. Sorry, not the Treaty of Lausanne, but the dissolution of the Caliphate occurs in 1924. But at the Treaty of Lausanne, which is signed in 1923, Turkey, as it will become called, agrees to relinquish all claims to former Ottoman territory. So this is where now people will say this is where the formal handover of the legal ownership of these lands are given towards the Allies, towards the British, and the British mandate of Palestine begins. This is where you'll see that the Palestine Citizenship Order was issued in 1925, but the mandate kind of begins on 14th of May 1948, which is where you'll so the mandate begins on the 1925. Sorry, the 1st of August. This is where you'll see that the mandate of Palestine becomes a state, you could say, with a government, with citizens. Everyone that lives there is a citizen of the mandate of Palestine. And it's called a state. It's a state of Palestine. The mandate is still a state, even though it's, let's say, watched over by the British. But it's still a state, and everyone has citizenship there. This will be very important for arguments going forward.
Yeah, it's very important. Yeah.
Because you could argue today, and we'll stay for the second part, of course, but you could argue today that basically, if everyone was a citizen of the mandate of Palestine back then, that everyone that lives in the mandate of Palestine right now, today, should all have equal citizenship as they did back then. Right? The reason why you might think, well, okay, why is that? Is that controversial? Well, it is to Zionists, because Arabs outnumber Jews in the land of Palestine, both today as they did back then. And what you'll find is that Zionists are actually actively opposed to equal citizenship for all Arabs in the mandate of Palestine, along with Jews, because that means that Arabs are the majority. And if you have a democracy, that means that the government's going to be a majority Arab government, even if it's only today 51%. If you don't include all the people, all the refugees and their right of return, if you include them, it'd be even more. So this is very important. So the mandate of Palestine started out with everyone having equal citizenship as part of the government of Palestine, the state of Palestine. And I think you posted up in your Twitter, pictures of coins and to drain. Kind of drain lids and things like this, with the government of the state of Palestine on it, basically.
Yeah.
Now, at this point in time, because it was mentioned in the Mandate of Palestine, which is the Jews could create a kind of quasi-government organization which the British would liaise with and work with, called the Jewish Agency, which was led by a Jewish executive. The reason why I mention this is that this was to organize the activities of Jews in Palestine. It was to form a type of an administration for them. It made the new Jewish immigrants coming in form part of an organized community, even though they weren't formally a separate state, almost like a state within a state, with the approval of the British. The Arabs never had or were given an institution that was recognized by the British that had the same kind of legal relationship with the British government. So you had informal arrangements, but the Arabs of Palestine, whom at this point in time, most of them were villagers and farmers and so on and so forth, they had no ability to politically organize. They had to learn it, but even then they were divided. There was no officially recognized institution that would liaise with the British government or have sway with the British government. And this led to why the Palestinians were unable to deal with what would later become, I suppose, the State of Israel, but would later become organized militias and forces that were Zionist militias and forces. They had no chance to resist them, because even though they were the majority, they were disorganized and they had no institutions they could rely on. As also the fact they had no money coming in from outside, from banks and institutions coming from abroad, like the Zionists did. And so they were at a great disadvantage, even though they were the majority. Okay, so now we're going to fast forward from 1925 to 1936. There was discontent amongst Arabs. There was discontent. There was rioting and so on, as the Palestinians caught wind that, unlike their neighbors in Jordan, Iraq, and Syria, that they would not be getting a state of their own in their own land, despite the fact that they are the majority of people there. And this caused them to be very well, upset, to say the least, to feel discriminated against, to feel that they were denied national self-determination, because the Mandate of Palestine, while it did say that their civil rights would not be prejudiced, it didn't give them any political rights. And this omission obviously led to discontent. So the Peel Commission was instituted to investigate the cause of Arab discontent, because it's such a big, mysterious enigma. And they came with a number of conclusions. They said, now, here's what was happening. So I want to go to Algeria. I want to go to North Africa to explain some phenomena. The French government invaded Algeria. It took it over, and it began a colonization of Algeria by sending French settlers to Algeria en masse. It came up to 1 million. It was a very serious attempt to colonize a place, and was accepted internationally, not as occupied land or even as a mandate. No, it was accepted internationally as, this is France.
Exactly. It wasn't even a colony, technically, in that sense, of France. It was France. That they simply gobbled up North Africa and said, actually, this is France now. So it wasn't even a colony, like British had colonies. And no one thought that India was part of England, but France in Paris actually saw Algeria as part of France. And it had MPs in Algeria, French MPs that were in Paris in the Senate and so on. So it's extraordinary. Yeah.
One of the things that people didn't realize when looking at the French occupation of Algeria was, now, okay, when France took over Algeria, state land was available for the French, so they could sell it to private French settlers. But what they'd also do is they'd have French banks and French agencies that would buy Algerian lands being put onto the market by Algerians and sell it only to French people. But whenever a French person wants to sell their land, they can't sell it to an Algerian. They must sell it to another French person. So it was mediated by these institutions. So it was this one-way direction of buying and selling. So Algerians sell their land, and these institutions, these French institutions, will pay top dollar for it. And this seemed fine. But if a French person in Algeria is selling their land, they can't sell to an Algerian. They must sell it, but to another French person, or to these French institutions and banks that will buy it and then reallocate it to another French person. So you had this one-way procurement of land that's part of a colonial enterprise, and it was deemed to be fair because it was buying and selling. Right? They're not saying we're not forcing anybody to sell their land. Although they were selling state land, which was meant to be belonging to the state, but they were selling state land. Now, the same thing occurred in Palestine, the exact same thing. Wow. Now you might think, okay, buying and selling, and the people who are farming the land and they want to sell their land, presumably they will get good money for that, and they'll find their career elsewhere. But that doesn't fully describe the situation that was happening in Palestine. You had tenant farmers. So you'd have a landlord which would own over a big swathe of land, and you'd have tenant farmers who were Palestinian farmers farming the land. Then the landlord gets offered top dollar by the Jewish National Fund or a proxy, usually, to sell the land. So they say, okay, this is a good amount. I don't really even stay here much anyway. Sure, I'll sell it and make some money. And then once the land is procured by a Zionist agency, they will then kick out all the Arab tenant farmers and replace them with Jewish tenant farmers, or just Jewish farmers, I suppose. Now, if I was to buy a business, or anyone was to buy a business today, and the business has, let's say the business has 50% or Afro-Caribbean workers, and the rest are white English, because you could say, and they buy the business and they fire all the Afro-Caribbean workers and they only replace them with further, white English workers, we would say that's racist. That's a clear racist policy. Why are you firing only one ethnicity and you're only going to replace them with that particular ethnicity? And what the Zionists were doing was, in essence, they were clearing out everybody who was obviously not Jewish, who were tenant farmers, and replaced them only with Jewish tenant farmers. Mm-hmm. So this was the kind of policy that was happening. This led to high unemployment and a kind of an exodus of Arab tenant farmers into towns and cities who were landless because they were being kicked out of the farm they might have farmed for a long period of time. Maybe their families even had contracts going back over generations with the landlord family. So this was the first instance of where you might say Arab farmers being kicked off land. Yes, it wasn't technically, they owned it, they didn't own it per se, yes, but they didn't see it coming, and it was en masse. And it's a racist policy, but the Zionists said it was necessary in order to facilitate further Jewish immigration into Palestine. Also, the reason for Arab uprisings and uprising wasn't a full-on uprising at this point, but it was you had, of course, riots in the 1920s and so on and so forth. This led to the British government of the conclusion of the Peel Commission to say perhaps the best solution is to partition the land. This is the first time you see the discussion in a formal British government kind of level, suggesting that the best solution is to partition the land between Arabs and Jews. I know it's obvious, stating the obvious here, but here you have a white Northwest European country government deciding the fate of Arabs, Palestinian Arabs living in the Middle East without consulting them, without a democratic mandate, without any kind of consent. So that this is not some kind of objective, unbiased, or independent or neutral process at all. This is a colonizer from thousands of miles away deciding the fate, the outcome, the future of an entire people. And they have no
well, you have no right, because the League of Nations had given them this right, but of course it's a colonial thing. It's not like the colonialists controlled the machinery. It wasn't truly representative at all. So it's still very, very ugly by today's standards, or by the standards then. It's still very ugly, one might argue.
Yeah. Now, as I said, like in the 20s, there were just maybe, you know, mob riots and things like this. But it was in 1936 where you saw what was called the Great Arab Revolt. And this was where you saw a massive uprising. And so the Peel Commission was basically tasked to see what's been causing, you know, for the last decade and so, disgruntlement. But the Great Arab Revolt was the most serious concern for the British. Like, why are the Arabs very upset? What's going on? What could be making them so upset? And this lasted for about 3 years. They called the Great Arab Revolt. This was when you know, multiple villages and towns, all including those motivated by kind of governing factions within the Palestinian peoples, argued for a full uprising to shake off the British and kind of gain control of Palestine for themselves. Of course, it fails abysmally, but this is where we see the British allow Jews to form militias and to be armed. And so then Jews have legally sanctioned, well, initially legally sanctioned militias, but these militias then don't disband afterwards, but they go on to maintain their weapons and train, whereas the Arabs, you might call the Palestinians, they basically don't have the ability to form militias, and then they are, again, nowhere near organized. It was a very chaotic uprising, and of course it fails. So the Arab Revolt, which I mentioned, was brutally suppressed, and the British then reevaluate what the solutions might be required in that land. They produce a white paper in 1939. So white paper, obviously, is a British legal document, and it becomes adopted as policy by the British government for Palestine, which recommends limiting Jewish immigration because they cited that the large influxes of Jews coming into Palestine from around the world was too rapid, too fast. It was causing ethnic tensions on the ground, and also to give some leeway to Arab consent, even though, you know, the Palestinians weren't asked their consent for the mandate of Palestine to be a Jewish national home at all, but they were given some consent. The land sales were prohibited in certain designated regions to agencies like, you know, Jewish National Fund or what have you, from doing those policies I already mentioned, because many Arabs had complained that this one-way system of once you sell land, it will never come back it'll never be bought by an Arab again. It will never be offered on the market again. This is not a two-way system of market. It's a one-way system where they seem to always lose land, and they can't buy that land back in any way, shape, or form. But more interestingly, the British suggest the solution of instead of partition, a unitary binational state with equal rights for all. So instead of cutting the land up into pieces, keep the mandate of Palestine, well, the bit that excluding the Transjordan bit, but keep the mandate of Palestine as one state with everyone having equal rights for an equal citizenship. The Zionists rejected it, both the limitations on immigration, but also the fact that it should be a unitary state, because they were a minority, and if you give equal rights to the Arabs in a unitary state, they will be the majority, and they will form a majority government in a democracy. And the Zionists, Zionists don't want democracy when it's the majority are obviously are non-Jews. This shows how Zionism conditionally likes democracy, but not when it.
Well, I mean, to be fair, I mean, the West is like that in general. I mean, America has obviously overthrown many democratic countries. Governments have been elected in the 20th century because it didn't approve of the outcome, whether it be in Iran or in Chile etc., etc., etc. I forget the number. It's 50, 60 governments have been over, democratically elected governments. So it's only democracy when the Americans like the outcome. If they don't like it, then you're liable to be overthrown. So in other words, the principle is not there. It's basically what the self-perceived interests of the West are. That's the deciding factor, arguably.
Yes. And the reason why I mentioned the white paper is that the Palestinian leadership, as well as leaderships, the different factions, as well as Arab governments were actually approving of the white paper. They were not desiring to kick out Jews from Palestine, or remove them or kill them, what have you. They were totally happy to accept a unitary state with everyone given equal citizenship, because this is the land of Palestine. For them is one land. They don't want a border being put up in there. There's already borders being created around the Middle East as it is. They don't want to have a border, especially defined by ethnicity and by individuals who are obviously who they perceive as being Europeans, because Jews coming from Europe look Europeans, and they were speaking European languages. They weren't speaking Hebrew when they were coming from Russia or Poland or elsewhere, or Germany. So they didn't want to cut up their state, and they didn't want to see it partitioned. They wanted to be able to walk anywhere they want on their land, and they were totally happy to have a democratic system with equal citizenship. At least everyone is on the same level, at least given the same on the same have equal platform, basically.
Yeah.
Now it is roughly around this time we see from 1939 onwards that you see the rise of terrorist groups amongst the different Zionist factions. Now, while you see one group called paramilitary defense, it's called the Defense Force, the Haganah, who are where the majority of these kind of Jewish militias coalesce into under the Jewish Agency's direction into this informal militia called the Haganah. But you also had other groups called like the Irgun and the Stern Gang and others. These are quite infamous because these would engage in active terror campaigns against the British. They view the British as betraying them. Now, to be fair, it's not just then. Haganah, the Jewish Agency, and others argued that the white paper was a betrayal of the British promise to them. And what you saw is a beginning of an insurgency against the British there. You'll see the bombings, obviously, King David Hotel, and destruction of bridges and infrastructure, as well as killings of British soldiers starting to occur more frequently, mostly by the Irgun and others, and the Lehi as well. In October 1945, they even united all together to form the Jewish resistance movement. But World War II kind of put a stop to the insurgency, as they felt that they should focus on the German Nazi threat, because British were preferable to obviously the Germans, and it's not a good idea to undermine the British and leave the land open to German attack. So better to put a pause on that until the outcome of World War II. I think Ben Gurion can even argue that he said we will fight the Germans as if there was no. We will ally with the British and even send volunteer forces to ally with the British forces against the Germans as if there was no white paper, he said. So we will pretend it doesn't exist just for the sake of fighting the Germans. But they will continue to campaign against the white paper and to resume Jewish immigration, as well as to resume the project of at least some kind of partition between an Arab state and a Jewish state. Now, the white paper established that there would be, within 10 years, an independent Palestinian state, so the whole state would become independent. In 1946, there were two plans offered that were, in a sense, halfway houses between partition and creating a kind of federalism or autonomous regions within the land of Palestine as a way to placate both sides, although the Arabs and Palestinians rejected that, saying that we don't want partition in the land of Palestine. We want to keep it as one land with equal citizenship for everybody.
Indeed.
Now, so this is just after World War II. World War II did change things a lot, to say the least. One of them was that there was now a massive amount of Jewish immigrants which were leaving Europe and wanted or had already left Europe, but put in places like Cyprus and others, waiting to be relocated. And of course, the Allies weren't as so willing to give these Jews asylum, but they did want to see if they could be sent to Palestine, because, again, even though the West had persecuted and massacred Jews by the millions, they never accepted the responsibility enough to repair the problem itself by giving them land or territory in their own lands, but send them off to somewhere else. Now, the British were stuck between a rock and a hard place, in the sense that they didn't want to inflame all the regional Arab regimes who were their client regimes, but also these client regimes were facing pressure from their people. At the same time, they didn't want to renege on their promise to Zionists and the Jewish Agency, and so they did what I think the British are famous for when they're stuck in a rock and a hard place, which is they offloaded the problem to somebody else.
Yes.
And they gave it to the United Nations. I said, okay, you know what? We have no authority to give the whole land to one or the other, or to just give it to both. We will give it to the United Nations to solve this problem. The two plans that in the various conferences, London conferences, didn't solve anything. No one agrees on these plans. So we're going to give it to the United Nations, and they will resolve it for us. We will accept whatever the United Nations come to as a conclusion. Now, I won't get into as I said, what I'm offering everybody here in this brief history of Palestine is like a big picture view. There is a lot of detail here. There's a lot of shenanigans. The British seem to impede the UN implementation team who come to implement the partition. They impede them. They don't allow them to do their work. They even move back, also not move back, so they move forward the termination of the Mandate of Palestine to May, whereas before it would have been a bit later on in the year. This is a different discussion, which I won't go into. But suffice to say, the United Nations Special Committee in Palestine, which was created in May 1947, they passed the idea of partition, despite many protests by the Arabs saying that this is a very bad idea. We don't want this. Why can't you just keep it as a single state? They passed the plan. It was agreed by UN General Assembly, and it was declared on the 29th of November 1947. Now, the plan recommended the mandate terminate as soon as possible, up to the maximum of the 1st of August 1948. But the British declare the end of the mandate on the 15th of May and basically skedaddle. They tried to withdraw. That's a different discussion as to why, but this is what happened. So 1947, 29th of November is when the UN declares the partition plan. Now, just so you understand, so Jewish settlement in Palestine by 1948, the settlements here are on the right-hand side, as you can see, is where you see that the majority of Jewish settlements. There was a plan by the Jewish Agency when it noted, when partition was being discussed, that the Negev, which is the desert in the south, was going to seemingly be given to the Arabs because there was hardly any settlements there. And so they came up with the 11-point plan, which they would quickly establish settlements there so that they could claim the Negev. And then it was given to them by the UN partition. What you see on the left-hand side is the kind of the rates of Jewish immigration and how it changes, in essence, the demographic mix of people in the land. So even by 1948, after World War II, after a lot of refugees from Europe, Jewish refugees from Europe, Jews still form only 33% of the total population of Palestine. And if you were to grant the whole of Palestine as one state, they would be obviously a minority. But even the UN partition plan, which we see here, here's the UN partition plan, which is one of those images you see on the which I showed you at the very beginning of this presentation, where you have Palestine being reduced, smaller and smaller, the area of land that was for the Palestine, the state of Palestine. Even in that area, Arabs were actually 40% of the population. So in the area that's partitioned for the Jewish state, Arabs were 40% of the population.
Wow.
We'll discuss in the next part. But Ben Gurion, the kind of head of the Jewish Agency, which is the precursor to the Israeli government, mentions with concern that how can you have a Jewish state with 40% Arabs? That's too much. Yes, there might be a minority, but that's a very big minority. They'd still have
really hard. Yeah.
Some might say that was a prelude to what would come later. This noting of concern, his commanders. It's a very concerning thing. There's so many Arabs here.
What? The Middle East? Good grief! Who would have thought?
Yes, and this would lead to the first war in Palestine, which it wasn't the Arab-Israeli war of the Israeli War of Independence, they called it. This was the civil war in Palestine that began in 1947. So after the resolution was adopted, one of the main, you could say, institutions of Arab leadership, although they weren't a formally recognized one, and at one point even outlawed by the British, the Arab High Committee, the AHC, their reaction to the United Nations resolution was to enact a general strike that lasts for 3 days. So, not to go to work and so on and so forth. At the same time, the Lehi and Irgun intensified their bombing campaigns and terrorist attacks against Arab areas. They would chuck grenades into Arab crowds, detonate bombs in streets and things like this. So now this had been going on, but the point I wanted to make here is, even amongst the Palestinians who were, because they were disorganized, not because, but rather, I suppose, their disorganization was an evidence of this, that there was no organized assault or attack against Jewish areas or cleansing operations by Arabs against Jewish areas at all whatsoever. There was no offensives, military offensives, or commanded by any of the Palestinian leadership in Palestine against Jewish areas. So there was no initiation of operational level violence by Palestinians, but there was this low level tit for tat kind of attacks where you'd have one person shoot at a bus, and then next day someone throws a grenade into a crowd of in an Arabic marketplace. You have this general. This has been going on for some time, so it wasn't anything new. But what was new was what the Haganah, the military of the Jewish Agency, the precursor to the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, quote unquote, is they begin to implement, in their own words, clearing operations. And this would involve clearing Arab villages. They would assault Arab villages, and it would just be coincidental, of course, that this would create a mass exodus of Arabs from these villages, because it's a strange phenomenon when you fire mortars and you burn houses, the people in those areas tend to run away. It's a strange phenomenon. I don't know how you can explain it. And this led to 100,000 Arabs becoming refugees by the end of March 1948. This is before the war with the surrounding Arab states. This is very important to notice because, in essence, the Jewish Agency and the Haganah they launched the clearing operations, and they wanted to clear out the areas which were in the areas allotted to the Jewish state by the UN, secured those areas, they call it, where they were Arab concentrations. So in that graphic you see on the right-hand side, the dark blue represents the zones of Jewish settlement and concentration, and the lighter blue represents where it's mostly Arab concentrations. But by the end, well, up to the, I suppose near the end of May 1948, the following year, you see that these zones had been cleared, cleansed, purged, what have you, secured. Now, not all Arabs were expelled from those areas, but by the end of it, you saw the percentage that you still have today in Israel, percentage-wise, which is 20%. So the Arabs went from 40% of the population of those areas to 20%, a more manageable 20% population.
It's interesting because I wasn't very aware of this civil war. This is before the War of Independence, the Israeli War of Independence in 1948, which I normally think of as involving forced migrations, out of Palestine. But it actually began before that, with what we would say called terrorism. These were the terrorist acts by Jewish gangs, forcing, ethnically cleansing indigenous Arab communities and homelands. This is a very unambiguous example of terrorism to achieve ethnic cleansing, and yet this is actually before the famous, I'd say, Israeli War of Independence of 48, which is usually seen as the great forced migration. But as you're pointing out, this actually happened before that. It's a terrible crime, and it's obviously facilitated and supported, as always, by white Western Christian nations, because they were Christian more so then than they are now. So this is old news in a way as well.
I'd like to draw your attention as well to, if you look in the top of the graphic, you'll see on this topmost left part, you could say, there's a blue area that controls the coastal areas, and it seems to be kind of penetrating inland a little bit with two prongs, if you notice that. Yeah. Now, just compare that to the official UN partition. So just like this, you see there, and there. There was attempts. Now there was attempts to actually take over. Now that north part is called the Galilee, the central north part up there, and the Haganah and the Jewish Agency, they launched into areas. They invaded into areas which was meant to be given to the Arabs, so the Arab states. So they had no compunction in even breaching the UN partition, and taking over areas which were meant to be given to the Palestinians for a Palestinian state. So they actually took military control over those areas. And in essence, wherever there was a Jewish settlement, they would seek to link it up as best as they could within that time. Of course, they couldn't get to all of them. They didn't want to have disconnected settlements. They didn't want to have Jewish settlements remain in the Arab state. They wanted to have a continuous connection of all the Jewish settlements in one Jewish state, even if that was on areas that was given to the Arabs, despite the fact that they would later officially declare the state of Israel within the area allotted to them by the UN. They would make that an official declaration, even though they were still controlling land that was not part of the partition allotted to the Jewish state. Mm-hmm. Again, all this becomes very relevant for the arguments that we made by Zionists later on, that, we don't invade places, we don't take over places, we just defend ourselves. They were not facing existential military operations at that time, and yet they took over the areas. Now, what they will say is that, the leadership believed that there would be, or there could be, invasions by Arab armies, and they wanted to secure all these strategic zones that would be possible invasion routes and things like this. That would give that excuse, but at that point in time, the Arab states didn't indicate they would invade at all whatsoever. Ironically, it was due to the massive influxes of Palestinian refugees kind of swarming out of Palestine to seek refuge from the barbarity they were facing, and they were facing a lot of barbarity. I won't go into details in this presentation. That forced them, their populations demanded the governments do something about it, like save these Palestinians. And this was despite the fact the Arab governments were exhorting the Palestinians to not leave Palestine and stay in there. It was, which would become an important point later on to note when you discuss with Zionists today. Okay, so the Arab-Israeli War, as you know, as everyone knows, that begins in 1948. So this is the following year from the UN declaration, from the clearing operations. So between April and the 14th of May, the Jewish agency forces had already conducted 8 full-scale military operations outside of the area allotted to the Jewish state under partition. So 8 military operations against the areas of land that was going to be given to the Arabs under the UN partition. Arab states are very concerned, obviously, by this. They see that it's getting out of hand. The British aren't doing much. They do curb some excesses, but they don't do much to stop the general military operations that are occurring under the Haganah. So they issue a memorandum to the United Nations saying that the Arab League will get involved to rectify the problem of what's happened to the Palestinians. They cite the massacres that's happened to the Palestinians. The Deir Yassin becomes a thing. These are well, Deir Yassin, but like massacres like the Deir Yassin are heard by multiple sources and are severely concerning for many people outside. The Arab states issue a memorandum to the United Nations that saying that if you're not going to get involved, we have to get involved to save the Palestinians that are being brutalized and massacred. And then they envisioned what would be the solution. The solution didn't say is we need to massacre all Jews, we need to kick out all Jews, we need to expel all Jews. Nothing like this. The memorandum states that the solution is a single state for everybody, equal rights, with a special emphasis on minority rights as well. So that if the Jews are worried about being treated as a minority, we'll make sure that there's enshrined in their cast iron rights for minorities. Partition. You can't have wars for land and for demographics. It has to be a single state, everyone given equal rights. This is what is actually said by the Arab League as the basis for their intervention, but there were still debates amongst the members of the Arab League as to whether they should invade, as to whether they'd even win, because their armies were still brand new, many of them untrained apart from Jordan, which the Arab Legion in Jordan was very elite. So this was what was happening. Of course, ultimately then they faced pressure by their populations to intervene. In the next part, I'll mention some very shocking kind of discourses between Arab diplomats and politicians and British diplomats when they actually confess that they actually don't want to go into Palestine. They actually have they're not interested to do so, but they're worried that their own populations would rise up against them if they didn't, basically.
Oh, amazing.
There's a lot more eye-opening stuff. I mean, this is why all I can do is really scratch the surface. For your viewers, just
very. I mean, it's extraordinary information you're sharing here. Extremely helpful, actually, to get a fuller historical context of what's going on, which is usually missing from Western, journalism and media outlets. So that any of this context is simply missing.
Yeah, but it's a matter of public record. The cable that was sent by the Arab League to the United Nations is a matter of public record on the United Nations website itself. You can see everything I've just mentioned to you on that cable. It's there, but people seem to not mention it to discuss, like, wait a second, the Arab states didn't want to wipe out all the Jews or throw them into the sea. Yeah, there was rhetoric by some politicians and so on and so forth, but these very same politicians signed their name under the very same cablegram, indicating that they only are intervening because of what's happened to the Palestinians. They want to restore law and order in Palestine because it seems to be, for them, a free-for-all of brigandage and massacres and so on and so forth. And they want to see a one-state solution come out of it, with everyone having equal rights. And we'll discuss. I'll discuss in the next part. But there's even diplomatic discourses between the King Abdullah of Jordan and Golda Meir. This is before she became the prime minister. At that point, she was just part of the Jewish agency government, you could say, or later become the Israeli government, where the King of Jordan doesn't actually, doesn't want to get involved, but he wants to only take over the West Bank. He says he believes the West Bank should be part of Jordan. He doesn't really want to take over the areas allotted to the Jewish state, but if he's ever forced to, he would grant them autonomy. So this was this back channel communication. This was in Golda Meir's memoirs, where she talks about this back channel communication between her and King Abdullah of Jordan.
Wow. So
there was no intent to wipe out the Jews and massacre the Jews, and there was none of that stuff that becomes the propaganda of Zionists today. In fact, there was, you could say, a lot of reticence by the Arab governments to even go in there if it wasn't for their own populations being outraged by what's happened to their Palestinian brothers. So, okay, the war begins. I won't go too much into detail, but there was at one point embargoes on arms that was implemented to reduce the conflict. And what most people don't realize is the Soviet Union supported Israel, and a communist state, Czechoslovakia, supplied Israel, what would become Israel, I suppose, its weapons, its ammunition, thousands of rifles, millions of bullets, even planes and bombers. It was supplied to them, and people often gloss over the fact that there's a reason for this. It's because the early Zionists, Ben Gurion and others, they were socialists.
Yes, that's right. They were.
And the Soviet Union hoped that Israel would become a Soviet, it's not Soviet, but a socialist republic.
Yeah.
That would be part of a communist bloc. So they wanted to curry favor, and that's why they encouraged all the Soviet states to vote in recognition of Israel when it seeks application into the United Nations. But of course, obviously, Israel wouldn't become a socialist state as the Soviet Union would have wanted. But it's just an interesting point of history. Another shocking thing, and this is why I find history so fascinating, it's filled with shocking facts that are so counterintuitive to what you would imagine. The Israeli War of Independence, quote unquote, or the first Arab-Israeli war, is often depicted as David versus Goliath. That you have this, very small state of Israel with its small militia force that's only just now becoming semi-professional, and it was swarmed by these hordes of Arabs with latest equipment and outnumbering them. But that's not actually the case. The starting strength of the Arab armies in total was around 10,000 troops, but over the course of the war, that increased to 50,000 at a maximum. But the starting strength of the Haganah, and then later on would be called the IDF forces, was almost 30,000 troops, 3 times the amount of forces the Arabs sent in there, and with its strength increasing to over 100,000. It was 117,000. So the Arab armies that were sent in to Palestine were always outnumbered by the Israeli forces. They were never at any point did they outnumber the Israeli forces they were fighting. Also, there's other issues, the other questions which are raised, such as the Egyptian army. It was meant, or it was believed, that it would invade via Sinai, go up to take over Gaza, and go up by Ashdod and all the way to Tel Aviv, which is the capital, and would take it over. It stopped at Ashdod, which was where the UN partition said was the Arab appointed land. If I just can go back and show you on the Ashdod. So if you see Gaza on the left hand side, Ashdod is at the northmost point, and there you can see Tel Aviv is just above that. It stopped roughly where the Arab partition was given by the UN, and it didn't advance any further, even though there was for a good part of a week, no Israeli forces opposing them. I'm not going to go too much into details, but just remember that Egyptian army seemed to just not take over, not want to take over Tel Aviv for some reason. The Jordanians also wanted at least to just take over the West Bank and of the Jordan River and not go beyond that. Even, as I said, Golda Meir related in her memoirs that she received assurances that the King Abdullah didn't want to take over all of Palestine, especially that the UN partition areas for the Jewish state. But he said if he had to, he would give them autonomy. These are just points that to remember as the audience, and this will make more sense when we look at some quotations later on.
Okay.
Okay, this is just a summary of what happened on the left. As I said, you can see the Egyptian army went up to Ishtud is there, and it stops and doesn't go up to Tel Aviv. You see the Transjordanian forces and Iraqi forces, and again they just take over the West Bank, and they're kind of content to stop there and not go beyond. Even though strategically speaking, they could have cut the Jewish state in two if they had wanted to, but they didn't. On the right-hand side, you see what happens at the end of the war. You see the West Bank is taken by Jordan, and Gaza is taken by Egypt, and they form what's called the Green Line, or the armistice lines, which these were not formalized borders, but were rather agreed lines of where there would be a indefinite ceasefire, and there would be a promise not to violate that ceasefire or continue military operations, and it would be subject to negotiation as to what would be the final borders, but it was agreed that there'd be no invasions past these borders, the armistice lines. So sometimes it's called that you might see it called the Green Line because it was demarcated in green ink by a guy with a map. You could say a general with a map had a green pen for some reason, and hence it was called the Green Line. But you might see people call it the armistice lines or 1948 borders. Sometimes confusingly, it's called the 1967 borders, and now it is now called 1967 borders because prior to 1967, that's what the borders were, or the lines were, so to speak. But after that, it was changed. So sometimes people call it the 1967 borders, or 1948 borders, or the Green Line. It all means the same thing. Hope that's clear.
Clear enough.
Okay. So again, just another map showing the positions and the attacks. The Lebanese army only sends a token force. The Christians were, and again, this is not contentious, as in no historians don't really debate this. Some kind of parts of the Christian government were bribed by the Israelis to stay out of the war, and so only a token force of Lebanese forces came and didn't do much, and then they went back into Lebanon. The Syrian attacks only came from Syria and Jordan and Egypt. Okay, aftermath of the war, a further 600,000 more Palestinian Arabs became refugees, and they moved from the areas which are now, which are on the right-hand side. You might see Israel proper, just for the sake of nomenclature, we'll call it Israel proper today, which is the UN recognized boundaries of Israel. They moved from there into Gaza and into the West Bank. So there was displacement of Palestinians. We see massacres occurring. I wanted to highlight this, that when the Jewish settlements were taken over by Arab forces, the people were taken prisoner, and after the war they were returned back to Israel, or given to the Israeli state, given back to the Israeli state. We never saw the type of narrative that Zionists say today, which was a war of annihilation, of genocide. Because if that was the case, why not wipe out every Jewish settlement and all its inhabitants that you encounter as an Arab army? Instead, following the rules of warfare, they took prisoner all the Jewish settlements that they came across, everyone prisoner, and then they returned them back at the end of the war. Just a side point, but it's important to note this because it contradicts the simplistic and completely false Zionist narrative of today.
And I just recommended this, but I always do, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine by the historian Ilan Pappé. And it says on the back, the 1948 Israeli War of Independence involved one of the largest forced migrations in modern history. Around 1 million people at this very time you're talking about were expelled from their homes at gunpoint. Civilians were massacred, and hundreds of Palestinian villages were destroyed and denied for almost 6 decades. Had it happened today, it could only have been called ethnic cleansing. And this is a very well researched and impeccably referenced work. A lot of the sources come from the Israeli archives themselves that have just recently been uncovered. So if you want a detailed academic treatment, that's certainly one place to look, I think. Ilan Pappé.
Yeah. Also, Benny Morris is not a good historian. And he's a pro-Israeli or Zionist, but even himself has actually documented quite objective, well, to some extent. I mean, I don't know, they probably have debates, but I'm actually quite impressed with the level of objectivity he's demonstrated, even though some might argue that he's partial in some interpretations, but he likes to portray history as the facts show. So anything by Benny Morris as a historian, a book like Righteous Victims is one book. The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem Revisited is one, as well as the First Arab-Israeli War is another book. So these are other books you can look at as well. Okay. So yeah, the armistice green line. So just on the right-hand side, you can see the difference between, in red, is the difference between the Arab territory that was, the territory that was given to the Arabs by the UN partition and what the Arabs finally got at the end of it. So in red would have been what the UN partition allotted to the Arabs, and at the end of it was what was taken by the Arab states. Yeah, they concluded, of course, that there was, as I said, that they invaded or came to the rescue of the Palestinians at their own invitation because the Palestinians were unable, they were not organized, not trained, and were ill-equipped to deal with the Haganah forces that had Czechoslovakian weapons, trained. Many of them, some of them were veterans from World War II, veteran pilots, and so they were outclassed and outfought by more organized opposition. They had no chance. So this is what you see in green is the best that the Arab states could get with the forces they sent. As you could argue, why didn't they mobilize their populations? Why didn't they send more? It's a different discussion for another time, but that was the aftermath, and this is what's called the green line. Also with the dates, for anyone who wants to read it, of where the armistice was signed by the different countries. Okay, on the 4th of March 1949, the UN approves the recognition of Israel. This is quite important. I think how people try to understand how borders work with the UN is the UN kind of takes a snapshot of the country as it is, I suppose, once it exceeds into the UN. So whatever the borders were that the country had, once it becomes a UN member, as a kind of almost a form of convention, the UN considers that to be its borders, its territory, which is why the UN has never argued that Israel must withdraw from the areas given to the Arab partition. There's some other discussions here about, like, you know, are UN resolutions advisory or binding? It's different. I'm not going to get into that, but that is what forms what is called Israel proper, which I just see there on the right. This is what the UN sees when it sees Israel, so to speak. It sees this on the right hand side, and that's the territory it sees. Okay. Little known fact. The first Palestinian government actually was set up in 1948 on the 22nd of September in Gaza City. It was called the All Palestine Government. It was, in theory, had jurisdiction over the West Bank and Gaza itself, although West Bank was controlled by Jordan, and Jordan didn't care and didn't recognize it. But It had a president, it had an administration. So whenever anyone ever says to you, when has there ever been a Palestinian state or government, you could say the mandate of Palestine is one. The second one is this one, I suppose, the first Palestinian government in 1948. Some people might say it was a client, it was just a puppet regime of Egypt, I suppose. Maybe there's some truth to that. Of course, I mean, they certainly only had a nominal jurisdiction. They didn't have much power because it was protected by Egyptian military. They had to be there to prevent the Zionists from invading it. But it was nominally dissolved in 1953, and as Gaza became part of Egypt, and Egypt became part of a bigger bloc for a small period of time called the United Arab Republic. That didn't last long, but anyway, that was the first Palestine government that was independent of the British, anyway, and the Zionists. If you would like to, if anyone ever asks, when has there ever been a Palestinian government and state? Well, the mandate of Palestine technically is that because you had citizenship, and it was called the government of Palestine, the state of Palestine, even though it was a mandate state. But this is also another one, if you'd like, just so you know. It's just a small thing, a point to mention. Okay, it was at this time that you see what you might call the insurgency begins. Palestinians that are living in Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan begin launching raids into Israel on small scale, very small scale basis. 1 or 2 people, sometimes 5 people, sometimes. These bands were called Fedayeen. So, basically those who, don't fear death, and they began to launch raids into what is called Israel proper, quote unquote, to maintain some kind of pressure on Israel. One of the key issues was that when the Palestinians left the lands of what is called Israel proper today, because they were running away from being bombarded, shot, killed, houses blown up, or threats that this would happen, which was one of the psychological tactics used by the Haganah. They'd have loudspeakers saying, leave, otherwise you're going to get it. They started to come back, thinking, okay, well, war's over, there's peace, we'll come back to our houses and our villages. And of course, they get stopped at the border, and Israel say, no, you don't come back. You stay out. Even though they were fleeing being blown up and being killed and so on. They never left voluntarily because they felt like it, because it's gone on holiday. Now, there's propaganda by Zionists, of course. They'll argue that, they heard a radio broadcast by some Arab governments that told them leave during the Arab-Israeli war, whatever you want to call it, the First War of Independence, as Zionists might call it. Leave and we'll defeat the Zionists, then you can come back. That's mythical. There's no evidence for that at all whatsoever. And we'll discuss that in the next part, but what you actually see is a preponderance of the opposite. These Arab states telling the Palestinians, stop, don't leave. You're emptying out the place. Like, we need to maintain, towns and villages that are, that are there, because you're being ethnically cleansed. We need to maintain presence there. Don't just leave. They try to stop them, even threatening them. At times, like, don't leave. Like, you're not gonna. We'll treat you harshly if you come here, because you shouldn't desert your land. You shouldn't run away. That's easy to say when you're not it's not your family being threatened by mortars and terror gangs of Ergun and others. But the actually Arab states made in multiple publications, which are on record, to say, don't leave, stay in Palestine, fight. But when they obviously had to leave and they tried to come back, this is when when Israel stops them, and then many are quite angry and upset that their lands have been taken away from them. They can't go back to their towns, villages, and they begin launching an insurgency against Israel proper. Many people, of them, are resentful at what happened to them and the denial of return. And the right of return is a very big key issue between Palestinians and Zionists today, which we'll discuss in the next session. Okay, so it's important also to note what was happening in the Muslim world at the same time, mostly Arab countries. So while you had Zionism and the stated goal of Zionists to take over Palestine, but it's it belongs to them. It is their land for a Jewish state. And at the same time, you had reports of massacres and killings of Palestinians occurring. In the Arab world, there was pre-existing Jewish populations there, pre-existed the state of Israel, and they've been living with Muslims there for centuries, and Christians as well. And now, unfortunately, there was some backlash to Zionism. One of the problems with Zionism was that it declared itself to be, in a sense, or the Israeli state declared itself to be the representative of the Jewish people, and that it was acting following the national or the global national will of the Jewish people, even though it doesn't have the authority to declare that, and Jews disagree with it, even disagree with its existence. But it was making those declarations. Unfortunately, many people from the Arab countries nearby were believing this, and they were seeing that the Israeli state was massacring Palestinians, and they unfortunately started to connect or believe that the Jews that lived alongside them for centuries was somehow connected to or had a sympathy with Israel, despite the massacres that it's committing, even though in many cases this was not the case. But in addition to this was the Israeli state's call, and certainly the call of many Zionists abroad throughout the world, and also in the Muslim world, to invite Jews to immigrate. It needed manpower, it needed population. Even prior to 1948, there was Ben Gurion initiated the 1 million plan, where they were going to prepare the Israeli state to absorb 1 million people over a short amount of time. This was, in essence, a preparation for mass migration. Perhaps they believed it would come from Europe. But when you had various complications, certainly many Jews that were leaving Europe, many went to America when they were permitted to do so. They weren't going to Palestine. In fact, throughout all this period of migration, people were coming into Palestine from Europe after World War II, and then using it as a jumping off point to go to America. Right. Today, the second largest population of Jews in the world is in America. Only has 1 million less than Israel does. So America was a competing place for Jews to go to, with its promise of freedom and equality and what have you. It also goes its public image anyway. So what you had is there was both a simultaneous encouragement by Zionists to Jews around the world to immigrate to Israel, because it needs a population, and it was meant to be the Holy Land, and it was the promised land. But at the same time, there was unfortunately some antipathy generated by what people were seeing in Palestine, what was happening to the Palestinians. This antipathy generated amongst Arabs. Now, one particular Israeli historian, Avi Shalayim, Professor Avi Shalayim, he's an Iraqi Jew by this ancestry, and he reported, he wrote a book, a recent book about his family's experiences and so on. But he posits something a little extra into the mix, that Mossad, which was the secret service of the Israeli state, was involved and to some extent encouraging Jews to leave the Muslim world when they noticed in many parts of the Muslim world that Jews were totally happy and fine where they were living, that they would encourage a false animus against Jews by detonating sometimes bombs in Jewish areas or near Jewish areas, by encouraging animus against Jews in an area to get those Jews to be motivated to leave and go to Israel because they needed the manpower. Now, that's what Avi Shalayim contends. I would advise everyone to just look at his work and see what you think about it for yourself, whether there is some merit in this. He goes through some historical records. As we will see, Israel is not a stranger to using subterfuge as well as liaisons with back channel liaison with other governments, as well as even using bombing campaigns in other countries which have been admitted to, and there's no one contends, to achieve certain policy objectives. So which we can look into. But we have to be honest. We have to be open about this. There was mass migration of Jews from many Muslim countries. These Jews were living for centuries, for 1,300 years, if not longer, in these various countries. And there was a beginning of an exodus. Maybe there was the promise of better life because of the wealth that was coming into Israel. Maybe it was due to the zeal of Zionism, the zeal of the Promised Land as a narrative. There was competing and different motivations. Regardless of what was happening, I want to state that there was never a policy by Arab governments to evict Jews out of their country. There was never a sustained or mass policy. In fact, quite the opposite. Many of these governments, when you start to notice there was immigration of Jews leaving their country to go to Israel, they actually tried to stop it, try to prevent the immigration, try to keep them in the country, and not by either saying to them, if you leave, you lose your citizenship and not with us. There was different policies by different countries and so on and so forth, which vary. But this was the case. There was never a dedicated expulsion by the government, by its armed forces, of Jews from Muslim lands or Arab countries. Modern-day Zionists will depict this emigration as a ethnic cleansing. Will even say this is genocide, this is an ethnic cleansing. What about this? In a kind of to use a tu quoque argument. Quoque, as you know, is the Latin, means and you as well. But the Arab governments never mortared or bombed or shot Jews in the Muslim world to get them to evacuate their towns and villages and what have you. This is obviously not comparable to what the Haganah and then Israeli Defense Forces did in Palestine to the Palestinians. One point I mentioned here, just an example. Now, again, I want to stress all this is just scratching the surface. There's a lot of material here, but Mossad actually is documented. This is again not really disputed with the Moroccan government actually to help Moroccan Jews leave at one point. So initially, the Moroccan government wanted to keep Jews in Morocco, but then Mossad, by some various inducements, worked with the Moroccan government to encourage the Moroccan government to let Jews come to Israel, and then facilitated Jewish immigration to Israel. So Israel wanted the Jews to come. They wanted them to leave the Arab world. They were inviting them to, they were begging them to, come, we need your manpower, we need you to come and bulk up our population. Okay. Okay, so now let's fast forward a bit from 1949 to 1956. The Suez War, long story short, the Egyptians wanted to nationalize the Suez Canal Company, and Britain, having an old colonial stake in the place, as well as France, worked with Israel to prevent that nationalization of the Suez Canal, and basically they agreed a plan to take over the Sinai with British, French, and Israeli forces. Of course, Israel's right next door, so they initiated the invasion into Sinai. This was the next war after the so-called War of Independence, and it was completely initiated on the Israeli side. It wasn't the fighting, a defensive war against Arabs, repeated assaults. Many Zionists will use a narrative of Israel was attacked so many times. It was attacked again, 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 and with all these multiple wars, and we won. No, this was a war initiated by Israel, along with Britain and France. Due to pressure from America, who didn't want Britain and France kind of taking over the Suez, they managed to pressure everyone to go back. And so England and France had to reluctantly concede the Suez, and Israel went back to the borders recognized by the United Nations. And that was the end of that. But it's an example of Israeli aggression. Origins of the Palestine Liberation Organization, we see in 1964 the development of, you might call, an organized platform for Palestine advocacy. It was partly a political party, but also partly an insurgency and
But it wasn't. Correct me if I'm wrong. It wasn't actually an Islamic a Muslim organization. Hamas obviously is explicitly by definition, and of course it's that. But the PLO wasn't, was it? I think there were Christians who were involved at the highest levels.
Yes, it was avowedly a secular and Arab nationalist organization. So it didn't countenance religion so much, more than just a cultural feature of the Palestinians, one particular cultural feature, but not the only one. But yes, it was a completely secular party, and it began a formalized, you could say, armed struggle against the Israeli state, raids and attacks and hijacking of planes and things like this. This was a time when planes were being hijacked all over the place, but they weren't being flown into buildings. They were being used as to take hostages and ransom prisoners that were taken by Israel of Palestinian fighters. So this was the kind of work of the PLO. At the same time, it was trying to get recognition from the United Nations of the legitimacy of a Palestinian state, and they were fighting for what is known in international law as the right to self-determination, which was their main points of their arguments, of their campaigns, was they believed the Palestinians were denied their right of self-determination, which, according to international law, in essence, was what was happening. Now, for their efforts, they were kind of granted observer status in 1974, and they were led by Yasser Arafat until his death in 2004. Now, Fatah, which you might have heard as well, is a kind of a component of the PLO. Its majority faction, not the only one. There was a few Marxists here and there, a few others, but it was the majority faction, and sometimes it's viewed as a synonymous with the PLO. But it is not the same thing as the PLO, just for those who know. It is an acronym, of course. It means Palestinian National Liberation Movement, but also Fatah sounds similar to the Arabic word, to open, while something's closed, to open it up.
So like in Surah Al-Fatiha, the opening chapter of the Quran. Yeah. Now, during this time, there wasn't kind of a complete peace between Israel and its neighbors. Israel engaged in what it considered to be retaliatory raids. So whenever a PLO would infiltrate its borders, they might shoot an Israeli soldier or leave a landmine on an area where it will be patrolled by a military vehicle. So Israel's response has always been, it's actually been quite consistent, which is to be disproportionate and commit war crimes. And this was illustrated by, wasn't the only instance, but this was a famous instance, which was the attack on the Jordanian village of Samu. So Jordan had at its borders, so it controlled the West Bank, and at its borders with Israel, it didn't want to antagonize Israel at all whatsoever. It had UN observers on its borders, so around the West Bank, which Jordan controlled. Jordan had UN observers. It had its own police patrolling regularly and would arrest and sometimes even kill many Fedayeen and PLO fighters trying to sneak over the border, or sometimes just bandits as well. It was notable for doing a very strong and stern police job on its end, because it didn't want to antagonize the Israelis. Even though the PLO, actually, its base at the time of this was in Syria, there was a landmine that was deployed in Israel, or within the Green Line, as they say, and it killed a few soldiers, and Israel decided to respond. Now, there was no evidence that the actual attack actually came from Jordan. Even UN observers remarked at the time that monitoring the borders, they didn't see any breaches of it, and that they commended Jordan, but that did Jordan killed more Palestinian resistance fighters going into Israel, or trying to go into Israel, than the Israelis did. That was what Jordan was doing. It tried its best. But Israel is always unfortunately, if you look at the historical record, to revenge and to disproportionate attacks. And on the 13th of November 1966, it destroyed
a Jordanian village in retaliation for these attacks. It came in, didn't kill that many civilians this time, but it blew up buildings, damaged a mosque, destroyed and set fire and so on, as a retaliation. The village, I mean, what's the village got to do with the PLO or even the Fedayeen? Nothing. It reminds me a lot of, dare I say, you know, the French resistance fighters in World War II. If there was a resistance attack, occupying forces, which got unnamed, they would find the nearest French village and just destroy it and massacre the people there.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's true. In where I live in France, there's a little village just in the next village along. It's in southwest France. There's a memorial there because some of the occupying force, who shall be nameless, as you put it, were killed by the resistance. And what the Germans did, they went to this village near where I live, and they rounded up randomly. I mean, randomly 100 villages and lined them up and shot them. These are men and women, ordinary farmers, in retaliation. So that this is you're right. This is a tactic that the unnamed occupiers in France used in the Second World War, and it's been used by this other group that you're talking about now.
Yeah, I mean, in this particular case, that didn't happen. They didn't line up villages and shot them. Only 4 civilians, as I said, were killed. However, there were other villages where it kind of looked like something along those lines. Now, even the United States of America condemned the attack by the Israelis, and the United Nations issued a resolution condemning the attack against Jordan. Now, what would be noted by, I think, anyone who looks at the history of this is that Jordan, I mean, if attacks did happen across Jordan border, it was against Jordan's wishes, despite its best efforts, and it was never state sanctioned. Whenever there was a cross-border attack from the Israel side, it was state sanctioned by their military, and it created well, it's targeting civilian infrastructure at the very least, if not civilians themselves. I think people should see the asymmetry of the 2 protagonists as an example of Israel's policy generally. Now, this is there's actually a big quote here, and I only leave it for anyone. You want to pause the video, go look it for yourself. But the United States was worried about that Israel was undermining its client regime, and I say that a client regime in Jordan. Jordan was playing ball. Jordan was being paid by the United States of America $500 million to act as a stabilizing factor on Israel's longest border. So they were paid to basically, well, of course they wouldn't do anything anyway, but they were paid to be a stabilizing factor to stabilize Israel's borders. And you get this here from this memorandum that was given to President Johnson, the President of the United States of America at the time, in 1966. There's a lot of interesting facts here that come up, most people don't seem to realize.
Yeah.
And even noting with concern, it says that it makes that Israel's actions makes even moderate Arabs feel fatalistically that there is nothing they can do to get along with the Israelis, no matter how hard they try. So no matter what they do with the Israelis are going to act in very unjust manners towards their neighbors. But also the key point is the amount of money that the United States of America are pumping into the regional governments to keep them nice and friendly, and actually complicit and coordinating with Israel is a point. Because I mentioned that those claims, and I sometimes call them client regimes. So this is just one particular factoid where I give some evidence for. There's a lot of things I've said here which I haven't been able to give evidence for because of for sake of time. But inshallah, not just in part 2, but also in the course, we go through documents in detail. There's hundreds. There was quite literally hundreds of thousands of documents. Not that to read out there, but we go over some very interesting and ones that all show a consistent style, history of the relations of the Arab regimes to Israel. Now, due to tensions with Israel, Jordan accused Egypt of basically just doing nothing to help Jordan defend and to defend Jordan and so on and so forth. And Egypt was promoting itself as the champion of the Arabic world, that it was the defender of the Arabic world and the lead nation. So this plus the pressure from the populations, it caused Nasser to make some symbolic gestures of support. There's also a curious tale that the Soviet Union apparently told Nasser, for some reasons which are completely unknown to historians, we don't know why, that Israel was amassing an army along the border of Syria, as well as potentially with Egypt. So what Gamal Abdel Nasser, who's the president of the very charismatic Egyptian president at the time, he begins massing troops on the border with Israel. Now, the troops are nowhere near an invasion force. Intelligence reports at the time, even the Mossad reports and others, all acknowledge the same thing, which is that this is a show of strength. It's just to rattle sabers. It's not an invasion force at all whatsoever. The Israelis were unconcerned by that. But also he closed the Straits of Tyran, which is where shipping comes from to South Israel by its the port city of Eilat. Now that was, Egypt was in a situation where it had to at least show some indignation and rattle sabers to say that we are doing something. Look, we're making these gestures to to tell Israel that don't do it again. But Israel used this as an opportunity to in essence strike first against, well, they strike first, they call it striking first, but there was never, striking first implies that the other side were actually ever going to strike, but rather to just strike against Egypt, against Syria and so on. And it began a bombing campaign which caught the Egyptian Air Force unaware on the ground, destroyed them. It caught the Egyptian army by surprise because they weren't expecting any fighting, because they weren't going to do any fighting. And this led to a rapid ground advance by the Israeli army, which led to them controlling and taking over all of the Sinai in 6 days. So, and it's not the first time they took it back. That's where they took it. They took it in 1956, but this is them taking it again, and we have to wait for Egypt to take it back in the subsequent war. So this is the infamous 6 Days Wars, but they also took the Golan Heights. Now, as with Jordan, Jordan had placed their army under the control of an Egyptian general under a United Arab Defense Pact. There's a long story which I won't get into, but the King Abdullah was reticent to join in the fighting or what have you. I think he just tokenly fired some artillery shots into Israel, seeing that Israel is fighting Egypt and Syria, and Israel uses the pretext to invade the West Bank. This is where the West Bank gets invaded. The Israelis. Again, this map shows you the conquest of the Golan Heights by the Israeli forces in the north against Syria. Again, Syria was not launching any invasion army. Jordan wasn't launching any invasion army, and the Egyptians were not launching any invasion army. This is a war initiated by Israel, and even admitted by such that it was initiated. It wasn't a war of defense by subsequent Israeli presidents, which we can get into in the next session. Okay, so Israel took over these conquests in the bright green here. It signaled that it might return these lands in return for peace. So it might return Golan Heights back to Syria in return for peace. It might return Sinai back to Egypt in return for peace. But as some of the years went by, just a few years went by, and when Gamal Abdel Nasser signaled the possibility of of actually taking up on that offer, the Israeli military and now under Golda Meir, who is now the prime minister, was actually quite overconfident, thinking, well, you know what, our military is actually pretty unbeaten. We'll just keep it. They actually didn't want to talk about it. Actually, no, you know what? We want to come to that at the moment. We're kind of happy with what we've taken, because they've increased Israel's size multiple fold now. I mean, Sinai is mostly wasteland, but it can always be developed. At this time, Israel then took the municipality of East Jerusalem. So in the previous war in 1948, the Zionists took over West Jerusalem, and they held on to that. But East Jerusalem was taken by the Jordanians as part of the West Bank. And here they incorporate it into the municipality of Jerusalem in total as a united Jerusalem municipality. Now, the West Bank was never offered to Jordan back, saying, we'll give it back to you in return for peace. That was never offered to Jordan. So clearly they treat the West Bank rather differently than they treated the other territories. Now, the 1967 aftermath, it led to the three no's, the infamous three no's, by the Khartoum resolution, where the Arab League didn't want to actually give Israel formal recognition or peace, and were very outraged at. So after the war, the Arab states were indignant at having their land conquered and taken over by the Israeli state, and they weren't in the mood to negotiate, and they came up at the Khartoum conference with the Khartoum resolution, the three no's: no peace to Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. Now, at this time, there was only some good news for some Palestinians, which was the Palestinians in what is within the Green Line, armistice lines, or Israel proper, quote unquote, according to the UN, they had actually been living under military rule for almost 20 years, since 1948. So that 20% minority of Palestinians which hadn't been expelled or killed or massacred were actually living under a different set of laws and rules than the other citizens of that state. So I know many Zionists like to say that they treat they're called the Israeli Arabs. They treat the Israeli Arabs as equal citizens, but for the first 20 years of their existence within the Israeli state, they were under military law and martial rule. Only after the Six-Day War were they actually given, I suppose, full civil rights, which was different to what they'd been living under for 20 years. So after they'd been chewed up by 20 years of martial law and rule, they were allowed to be equal citizens in a civil sense. So their life improved a bit because they were allowed to be given full rights. So Israel, buoyed by its success and feeling itself invincible, probably felt like it could give them rights now. It felt like, okay, they're not threat anymore. There was also another major turning point in this war, which was that prior to this, the majority of religious Jews around the world arguably didn't have expressed much support or enthusiasm for Israel. Many of them still disagreed with the notion of an Israeli nation state, when it was believed by them that they must wait for the Messiah to come and establish the state for Jews, a state based on Mosaic law, a kingdom of God, not a nation state based with secular laws and liberal or socialist political policies. But this changed. It was viewed that Israel had divine favor by winning in 6 days, beating all the local regimes around it. And so this saw a sea change in support from many religious Jews around the world. And this began to then affect the demographics of support amongst Jews for Israel, even within Israel. And we saw that in the West Bank, which was newly conquered, the beginning of religious Jews venturing out and establishing settlements in the West Bank, which we now know today as obviously breaking international law. A small point, which was there was a mini war, you could say, just the duration of one battle called the Battle of Karama, where in order to destroy in PLO camps, so Jordan obviously began to host the PLO, and on its side, it faced an invasion by Israel. So it's not really widely reported. It was a limited incursion, I suppose. The Jordanian army fought them off. Again, the UN Security Council Resolution 248 condemns Israel for breaking the ceasefire yet again. Another aggressive policy by the Israeli state. But the Jordanian army seems to have fought them off. and they went back into Israel, although arguably the Karama camp of the PLO, they argue, is destroyed in the process. They will say, Israelis will say they achieved the objectives, and that was it. But just a small point anyway, to see there's a constant breaching of the borders by the Israeli state with its military into its neighboring states. Black September, there's a Jordanian civil war. So I won't go this in detail. You can pause it and read it for yourself. But basically, most people don't realize is that Jordan, after taking in so many Palestinian refugees, is, some people say, almost 50% of Jordanians are Palestinian, basically. And there was tensions and that between the PLO and others with the Jordanian government, and the Jordanian government is not doing enough, or is even taking seriously the fight against Israel and to seek self-determination for the Palestinians. They just seem to have given up on the West Bank and not done anything else. So the West Bank loss by the Palestinians is a further exacerbating factor, a further Nakba, you could say, because now they've lost more land, and now they don't control any land in the former mandate of Palestine. And so there was a lot of eagerness to do more to get back that land, but unfortunately, the Jordanians were very reticent to do anything beyond just make public verbal platitudes. Now, 1973, we call it the Yom Kippur War, others call it the Ramadan War. But Egypt, with Syria and its Arab allies, decides to launch a war to get back the lost territories, not the Palestine or West Bank, because Jordan's not participating to conquer the West Bank, but just to get back the Golan Heights and the Sinai. So this was a war that the Arab countries nearby did initiate. This wasn't a war that Israel initiated. This is one of the rare cases where the neighboring states actually initiated a war themselves, and it wasn't a war to destroy Israel. Everyone agrees. Any historian worth their salt would say this was never a war against Israel itself. It was always a limited objective, which is they wanted, Egypt and Syria wanted to get back the lands they lost. Syria kind of gets defeated, is unable to take back the Golan Heights. Egypt manages to get its army over the Suez Canal, takes over the east bank of the Suez Canal, and Israel can't dislodge them. They then later on use that as a negotiating position to kind of give, in return for giving Israel peace and normalization, Israel will give back the Sinai. So this is just, again, the opening moves by the Egyptian army on the left, and Israel was never able to dislodge them back into Egypt from Sinai, although Sinai is part of Egypt, but Sinai was kind of, the Egyptian army maintained its hold on the Sinai, and Israel was kind of forced to come to terms, whereas previously they hadn't cared to consider actually giving back Sinai, feeling that their army was invincible, but they faced some serious tactical defeats. So this was obviously before the war began. This is the finishing positions after the war. So before the war began, Egypt had lost Sinai to Israel, and after the war had finished, this was the positions where the Egyptian army was able to control this kind of golden sliver on the East Bank. Now, the Israelis managed to do a limited breakthrough past the Suez Canal into Egypt as a means to improve their bargaining position, but they couldn't hold that forever, and they had to return back anyway into the Sinai because they were extended into the other side of Egypt, and Egypt could just deal with them at their leisure. So this was just a ploy to kind of improve their bargaining position. That, we control some of Egypt, you control some of Sinai. But strategically, Israel knew they had to give up the Sinai because Egypt was not going to let go once it had its teeth back into its former territories. Anyway, the first Camp David Accords, the first Egypt-Israel peace treaty, the peace agreement signed in September 1978 for a phased withdrawal of Israel from Egypt in return for a peace treaty and some kind of normalization. So it's typically called as a cold peace because Egypt has peace, but they don't do anything else beyond just, no fighting, I suppose, at least officially anyway. So we're going to increase pace because there's again a lot here to discuss, and I'm conscious of the time, so you can read it and you can research it a bit more if you'd like. But this is now the first incursion into Lebanon. So Lebanon had avoided incursions into its territory since the 1948 war to 1949, but now Israel seeking to root out the PLO, which has a stronghold in South Lebanon due to all the Palestinian refugees that are in South Lebanon that had fled since the 1948-1949 war. So they invade, they ally with some nationalist Christian Lebanese forces who view the Palestinians, who are mostly Muslim, as being invaders, these non-Lebanese people coming here, and they're just, they're coming into our country, taking our jobs and marrying our women, that kind of thing. So it was a strange or curious phenomenon of Lebanese Christian nationalism. So Israel basically attempts to remove the PLO presence from South Lebanon, and this was one of the many operations they were going to initiate. So this is 5 years after their previous war. They don't like to waste time before their next war. Again, a second war into South Lebanon. Well, technically it's a third because they attacked in 1948 war too. But the second war in Lebanon, again targeting PLO, but in this case the PLO had to come to terms and leave Lebanon due to Israeli pressure, as well as inciting Christian militia. Now, it was these repeated invasions of Lebanon, it was in this particular war that would see the creation of the organization we know today as Hezbollah. So some of the people in Lebanon, some Lebanese who weren't Christian, were not very happy about Israel constantly invading and bombarding Beirut. So they seemed to react. And of course, supported by Syria and then later on Iran, the organization of Hezbollah would rise in Lebanon. It was during this time we see the infamous Sabra and Shatila massacre. Go and read it for yourself, where Israel in cahoots with Lebanese Christian nationalist group called the Phalange, which is the word for phalanx. They massacred a Palestinian refugee camp, Sabra and Shatila refugee camp, in the neighborhoods of Beirut. Now, you might have heard of this organization, Origins of Hamas. Around this time, so a couple of years around this time, we see Hamas is formed in Gaza, an offshoot of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. It was previously an organization that was, in essence, dealing with community projects and from the mosques there. It wasn't a formal political party that it would become later, nor with its militant wing, the Izzadin al-Qassam Brigade. But it gets formed in Gaza. Initially, Israel doesn't do anything to Hamas, and even views it as a potentially useful rival to its main enemy, Fatah. Divide and conquer, I suppose. Indeed, yeah, indeed.
Do we know what Hamas stands for? Obviously, is it an acronym? Is it in Arabic?
Yes, yeah. So I mean, it's basically the harakat for the front or kind of method for fighting and resistance, basically, if you were to give a translation, a rough translation. Okay. But it's an acronym, basically.
So it's a resistance. It's a resistance organization, a resistance against occupation. Okay.
I mean, that's what it is basically arguing it is doing. Like the PLO, they are both arguing that they are resistance organizations, right? But it views itself as the movement for Islamic resistance, I suppose, what the translation of it stands for. And it's kind of, at first, it doesn't have a military force. It's just a Islamically based. So it's trying to use Islam, not secular.
Because PLO is secular, yeah, okay, yeah. So this is part, it's a part of the global resurgence of Islam, isn't it, in a way, moving away from Arab nationalism, secularism, to a more Islamic-based conception of civil society, and okay.
Yeah. So yeah, it's more Islamically based, but basically, yeah, it's an acronym. The vowels aren't in the Arabic. It's just HMS. So Harakat al-Muqawama Islamiyya. So a movement for an Islamic resistance or insurgency or what have you. So it's one of the first, you could say, major players that arises amongst the Palestinians, which is not based on secular nationalism. It's based on, ostensibly, it claims it's based on an Islamic premise for the liberation of Palestine, to create an Islamic state, not to create a secular republic or what have you. So that all makes it different, and Israel views it as an interesting counterpoint to Fatah, the use of religion against Fatah and the PLO to undermine its main rival at that point in time. It then later on formed a military wing called the Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam Brigade, which remains its military wing today. So any military operations done by Hamas is done by that wing. Hamas is meant to be a political party, at least it will declare itself to be a political party, and its militant operations are done by this separate wing. That's in essence why you might have heard that mentioned. Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam Brigade, if you've ever heard that mentioned alongside it. A point to mention about its charter, 1988 charter, we will discuss this in the next part, but it's claimed that its charter is advocating for the genocide of Jews and massacre of Jews and so on and so forth as its aim, which we'll discuss in the next part, whether that's true or not. But I must point out that, as I said, whenever we investigate anything, we have to be absolutely factual about it, whether it's for or against any position that we hold. And of course, its stated objective in its charter is to create an Islamic state in Palestine where Jews, Christians, and Muslims can all coexist peacefully under Islamic law. This is what it says in one of its articles. So it's approaching not from a secular basis, but it doesn't mean that even if it's from a secular basis, that it must therefore be one of a genocidal, mass murdering political objective where it would kill all Jews in the whole world, which is what some Zionists say. So whether we disagree with Hamas or not, we have to be careful never to misrepresent anyone. At the same time, not misrepresent Zionists as well in what they say or what their arguments or their political parties believe in. In 1988, now in this year, a lot of things are happening. The Arab League gives officially financial control they give financial control of the funds which it gives to the PLO. It gives them some authority. It then creates a Palestine it recognizes PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinians, and kind of, in a sense, King Hussein just kind of flings on the West Bank onto the PLO's shoulders, saying, you know what, we renounce all claims to the West Bank. Now it's the PLO's concern. Now you deal with Israel, you negotiate with them, or you handle them. We're done with West Bank. So this is where the PLO both get more formal recognition from the Arab League in having some kind of finances, in having some kind of legal authority or representation behind all Palestinians. And this is also where you might see that Israel kind of sees the utility of Hamas, because Hamas thinks that the PLO basically don't represent all Palestinians and don't represent them because they're coming from a non-secular basis. So it's just an interesting point. This is where Jordan basically kind of doesn't care about West Bank anymore. Says, you know, we give it over to the PLO as they're concerned. Syria hasn't given up on the Golan Heights, although Egypt did give up on Gaza as well. That's also important. I forgot to mention that they did give up on Gaza. They formally recognized in the peace treaty in the Camp David Accord that Gaza will be now the concern of the whatever Palestinian authority is there. So they both give up on those territories. Okay, 1980 to 93. We see the rise of the first Intifada. We're getting to now almost modern times, or recent times, should I say rather. Intifada means in Arabic to shake off. They were going to do mass demonstrations, protests, civil disobedience, and a bunch of other things. Unfortunately, of course, there was violence involved. And this leads to almost 2,000 Palestinians dead over 5 years, and 270 Israelis dead. This was due, of course, to the dissatisfaction at the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. The military regime that the Palestinians were ruled under, and the similar things that were happening now, maybe not as bad, but still they were denied self-determination, they were denied sovereignty in their own land, and therefore this was the reaction. 1994, you see a formal peace treaty between Jordan and Israel, normalization, recognition and agreement of the borders that you have today, minus the West Bank. The infamous Oslo Accords. Now this is a turning point for the PLO. The PLO had been using violent resistance as one of its many means, as well as political campaigning. It made an agreement with Israel. Some would say to the detriment of the Palestinians in the West Bank because of what was agreed, which we'll get to in a sec. But the Palestinians, in return for an offer of some withdrawal of the Israeli armies from areas in the West Bank, the PLO must recognize the right of the State of Israel to exist, and basically, which they never did before, and renounce the use of violent resistance. So in return for that, Israel would withdraw from the areas which will later be called Area A. This, just trying to get a map. Okay, so this is the divisions of the West Bank. There's Area A, B, and C. If you look on the legend on the bottom there, well, anything that's not colored in is Area C. So the kind of orangey areas are Area A. That's where the Palestinian Authority, which would be the, you could say, some quasi-government that the PLO will form part of, will have full control of orangey areas you see there, Area A. Area B, they will have administrative control of those areas, so they will set the rules and laws, but Israel will control the security and the policing of those areas. The largest area, which forms 60% of the West Bank, is Area C. It's the area which is in white. And Israel will have full control, both in making laws and rules, as well as the security of Area C. That's where you see the Israeli settlements, and which are in kind of a purplish color. This is quite important, and this is where you see that final image on that we saw at the beginning of this presentation on the right-hand side. Now, maybe the Palestinians were very desperate to control areas and have the Israeli jackboot off their necks and have some respite in some areas. But this was at the cost of underwriting and signing the authority of Israel to control Area C, as well as to police Area B. And of course, anyone who's seen the recent, well, it's not only recent, but the recent invasions of Israel into Jenin. Jenin is on the north there, if you see at the top there, Jenin. Jenin is still in Area A, but Israel, as it sees fit, can send its army into there whenever it wants and arrests people. It's almost like you imagine that maybe it's a comforting thought that you think they would honor their agreement not to enter Area A, but they do whenever they want to, and they want to quite regularly. So, in return for underwriting the Israeli control of Area C, Israeli control of Area C has allowed them to do whatever they want in those areas. And Benjamin Netanyahu was caught on a kind of hidden recording, I think, talking about the genius of the plan, which is under the Oslo agreements, he can declare anywhere in Area C to be a security zone for armies, for soldiers, or barracks, whatever. A security. It needn't be a place that literally holds a military base. It can just be military land for security purposes, and it can be as large as he wants. You can declare that anywhere. So if that is in a place where there's a Palestinian village, that Palestinian village has to go because it's in a land declared to be by the military, to be a military zone. Of course, once they go and some settlers come in and begin putting a stake in the ground and bringing their traders, and if enough number of them comes in, well, that's just how it is, and they'll be allowed to do so because the Israeli law, the law of Israel itself, doesn't go into the West Bank, and this is a key point. The laws of the Area C are done purely by military diktats. So whatever the military says, whatever the military wants, including military tribunals. So the military court, the court cases occur purely in the Israeli military courts. Now, of course, and here's the weird thing, of course, and this is a quite convenient thing, unless you're an Israeli citizen, then as you're an Israeli citizen, you're still liable for what you do as an individual because you're an Israeli citizen. Even if you're in a land that's in theory outside the jurisdiction of Israeli law. What this conveniently creates is a two-law system where a Palestinian is under the diktat of law that they don't control, and they don't vote in parliament for a legislature to enact or to determine. They're told what the law is, and they have to obey. And as some of these laws, we'll see the next part, are insane and very, very stifling, to put it mildly. Whereas Israeli citizens in the West Bank are just under Israeli law, and they are entitled to proper court cases, proper representation, and everything, which you might not be getting the same degree in a military tribunal or court. I won't go into too much into the persecution of the Palestinians because that's more for the second part. But just so you understand what the Oslo Agreement entailed, the Oslo Agreement and the Taba Agreement, which is also nicknamed as Oslo II. Again, people sometimes put them into the same set of accords, the Oslo Accords. So both the Taba Agreement and what's called the Oslo Accords. So I hope that makes general sense in terms of the Oslo Accords. Many Palestinians think it was a really bad idea now that they are facing it, because also, as you can see here, the Palestinian areas are disconnected from each other. Mm-hmm. This means that Israel can, and it does, put checkpoints everywhere between these Bantustans, to use a South African term, or you could say camps, if you'd like, of a concentrating nature, or reservations, if you want to use the North American terminology. And to get from one of these areas to the other, where in a car journey, it might take you just 10 minutes or 5 minutes, can take 4 hours, as every time you go from one area to the next, you have to be checked thoroughly at the soldiers' convenience, by the way, so they can just put their feet up and watch YouTube while they're waiting in an ambulance, seeking urgent medical attention to get to the hospital. So that is Oslo, and some people think that Yasser Arafat was conned and duped into signing, in essence, a type of legitimacy for Israel's occupation. Now, the point of the Oslo Agreement was a phased withdrawal, that there would be, within 5 years initially, the Israelis would begin to withdraw gradually from almost all the areas, subject to a final resolution or negotiation of the final boundaries of the West Bank. But Israelis just kept saying, the Israeli government just kept saying, well, there's all these security concerns, and there's someone in one part of the West Bank dog bit some guy's some Israeli soldier's shoe. Therefore, the security situation is not being managed properly. Therefore, we can't withdraw just yet. And they've used that to prolong withdrawal till today. They still haven't withdrawn, even though it was meant to be initially just 5 years, from 1993. That's the circumstance we have now. It's a perpetual occupation of the West Bank, with increasing building of Israeli settlements. And as I said, there's much more besides this to tell you about the plight of the Palestinians in the West Bank, not just how they're treated, but also the kinds of policies they're under, the disproportionate distribution of water, where settlements get access to 85% of the water of the West Bank, whereas the Palestinians of the West Bank, who are the vast majority of it, only get 15% of the available water. But that's for a different time to discuss. Okay, the infamous Camp David summit in 2000. Many Zionists will go straight to this and say, this was where the Palestinians were offered peace, and they rejected it. They rejected these peace proposals that Israel had proffered to them. This was mediated by Bill Clinton, and it was with meant to be a final resolution, a generous peace deal offered to the Palestinians. One of the issues is that people like to quote, and we'll come to this in the second part, I suppose, but they like to quote the amounts. They say the Palestinians were so generously offered 95% of the West Bank, and they said no. Yasser Arafat said no, he didn't accept this. I mean, now, to put it in perspective, both the West Bank and Gaza are only 22% of the mandate of Palestine. And all the Palestinians in the land of Palestine, in the whole mandate, plus the Israeli Arabs, if you add it all together, they are currently 51% of the population. So they should be happy with, okay, I know the Israeli Arabs won't have to leave Israel proper, but they should be happy with 22%. Oh, no, less than 22%, 95%, 22%. How generous. Now, this is the Camp David proposal. Now, what you might observe in this, which is quite clear to all, is, yeah, Jerusalem doesn't seem to be part of this Arab state that they're offered. Like, how do the West Bank Palestinians access Jerusalem? It seems that the blue area is everything that Israel will annex. Right? You've got 4 discontinuous blocks, so it's not a contiguous state in the West Bank, and access to Jerusalem, well, you think you can see it for yourself. See, people like to talk about percentages, but they never talk about, the Zionists like to do this, but they never show you the map. Here's the map. Would any Palestinian or anyone accept that as their state, a state that's cut into 4 pieces with loads of settlements and barriers in between all these areas, including no access to what's meant to be the capital for the Palestinians, east of Jerusalem? Where is the ease of access? Where is it contiguously part of the state? It's not. And they even cut off from Jordan. As you can see, there is a blue kind of boundary, but separating Jordan and the West Bank. This is where the Israeli army wanted to put their army, because they can't trust the West Bank Palestinians to not let a Jordanian army, as if controlling the West Bank posed a threat to Israel before. Never did. But they say they have to put their army there to prevent the Palestinians from letting the Jordanians in to conquer Israel, as if that ever happened before. And in green, this is meant to be a long-term lease, so Israel is actually going to lease that area out. Whether they ever give it back is a different question. So they'll lease that area. Of course, now what people are usually lied to about this. They say that Yasser Arafat rejected this generous offer. He didn't, actually. He wanted more time, and the Camp David Accords, yes, he didn't say yes during the Camp David Accords. He wanted to continue the discussions into the next summit, which was at the Tabah summit, right? And continue with Ehud Barak's and continue to just. In fact, he was actually, as has been noticed by many individuals who looked at any historians, he was seemingly seeking to get from the Arab governments and from his own population to accept that deal, because Ehud Barak had told him that if he doesn't take this deal, they won't get another on the table for 25 years. Right? That's what he was told. Now, Yasser Arafat never said no, but time ran out because Ehud Barak had to terminate the talks because of his upcoming election. The newly appointed prime minister was, of course, Ariel Sharon, and Ariel Sharon was a right winger, and he didn't want to continue the peace talks, and he took out the proposal from the table. He removed it from the table. So actually, it was Israel that withdrew the peace proposal, just because Yasser Arafat wanted more clarification, wanted more time to see if he could get consensus amongst Palestinians. So even with this, the lie that the Zionists say is that he said no to this very generous peace proposal. He actually even didn't, even though I don't call this generous. I don't think anyone would actually call this generous, but that's what the facts are. Anyway, he didn't say no to it. Okay. Now here is where we're reaching. I think towards now recent times, and we'll go a bit more faster. But basically, a very key thing. It's called the Arab Peace Summit. Now, this is just a quotation of part of it. What was offered to Israel by the Arab League, as well as the Organization of Islamic Conference, Iran, and endorsed by Hamas as well, was Israel was proposed that if they just give back the 1967 territories that were occupied, West Bank and Gaza, that in return for that, they would recognize right to exist. They would normalize relations. All the Arab League, all those Arab countries would normalize relations with Israel. Would make peace, normalize relations. That includes Hamas, by the way, is involved in this, right? And Iran, right, is involved in this. And all they have to do is just give back those territories and sign an agreement, and there should be no problem. That was rejected by Israel. They say, we like the sentiment, you know, normalization of relations, that's really great, we like that, you know, we're not opposed to that. We just have issues with the proposal, and they rejected it. Now, I'd like to mention, and this is usually for the second part, very quickly, Yitzhak Rabin, the individual who's credited as being one of the, you know, an Israeli leader of peace, making peace between the Arabs and so on. He explained that the Zionists were always concerned with, firstly, they don't want to give West Bank and Gaza away because these are strategic areas they want to control. But at the same time, they can't annex them. At least in the normal way of annexing, means you have to give the population there equal citizenship. And he argued that even as far back as 1994, under a left-wing government, the Israelis the government decided that of the idea of separation is called hafrada in Hebrew. That hitting lines, he doesn't want to swallow 1.8 million Arabs into the Israeli state. It's very dangerous to swallow, and this is regarding the problem that Gaza posed to Israel, because Gaza, even though they had Israeli settlements in Gaza at the time, but because there was a high population in that area, and there's only a few Israeli settlements, it was more difficult for the West Bank to argue that they could be separate. separate. And this policy of Hafrada would later on lead to the withdrawal from Gaza. But the Zionists would then paint that as simply, we gave the Palestinians a state in Gaza and look what they did with it. No, there was a reason they withdrew from it. We see that in 2000, the beginning of the second Intifada and the investigation into that by the US, producing the Mitchell report. Again, I'm going to leave people to kind of investigate that for themselves. But Sharon being at the time was under a right-wing government, was very provocative to the Palestinians in both the hard line he took and visit the Temple Mount, as they call it, at the Al-Aqsa Mosque enclosure, and the area where you have the place where Muslims believe that the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven. He would, just so you understand it, we'll discuss it in the next session though, but that's meant to be guardianship of the Jordanian government. So the Jordanian government is meant to control the Islamic religious sites in Jerusalem. That was the agreement between Jordan and Israel. Israeli Jews are kind of the chief rabbi of Israel has declared that it is forbidden for Israeli Jews to enter the Temple Mount because as the former area of the temple, they'd be walking on the ground that is sacred ground, and to walk on it with your feet is considered to be sacrilegious, just so you understand. But also, if you to go into that area, you need to have permission from the mosque, which allows non-Muslims in with permission, and to be respectful. Aaron Shalom didn't care; he went in anyway. And regularly, the Israeli police violate the Temple Mount and just walk in and even go into the mosque of the Al-Aqsa Masjid enclosure itself. This causes anger amongst Palestinians because they get cleared out of their own masjid. So they need to go to pray. They get told to leave their own masjid because we can have all this police trampling in with a politician that is guilty of war crimes. You could see in what he has Israeli general behind some massacres, people believe. So this is very provocative. It starts the second Intifada. It results in many Israelis dead. This comes a need for many people that they should have a conciliation process to, like, we need to reopen the peace talks. But again, Arishon never really engages with peace talks with the Palestinians. He tends to, and it was under his watch that he basically began something called the full Hafrada plan, separation war in the West Bank as well as Gaza. And it's at this time we see a concrete approach applied to what was previously a policy enacted only by police checkpoints and security, the building of a separation wall, both in Gaza as well as in the West Bank. Now, Zionists will tell you that the separation wall around the West Bank, not perfectly around the West Bank, was because it was to stop bombing campaigns that were happening during the Second Intifada, because prior to that point, Palestinians would, with the appropriate permits, be allowed to leave the West Bank and work in Israel proper, as long as they obeyed the curfew and went back to West Bank at a certain time. So in order to prevent that, to stop that, they built a wall around it. Now, I think the Palestinians would tell you in the West Bank, they'd say, we have no problem with you building a wall around the 1967 boundaries, as long as you left yourself with it on the other side and you left us on our side, we'd have no problem with that wall. But no, the wall was not just built around the West Bank, it was built within the West Bank as well, especially around settlements to take land and to firmly keep that land around settlements. So as you can see from, I believe, if there's, yes. So we see the barrier partition as of 2005 is changed from this image. but you can see that this red line, which is the barrier partition, doesn't perfectly match the 1967 boundary or 1948 boundary. You can see that it's very heavily, you could say, biased towards land inside West Bank. So it kind of cuts off West Bank land from the Israel proper, quote unquote, and it even takes much more land, like around Jerusalem. It cuts right into the West Bank, as well as north of Salafit, which is just, if you look to the upper three quarters, or the second quarter from the top, you'll see how it cuts into and winds all the way around, almost near Nablus. This is the separation boundary, and of course, that's only in the 2005 one. It's actually worse now. So this was where, so this was where the building of walls now to separate the Palestinian population was built, and in Gaza too. And this really then precludes a possibility of the Palestinians becoming equal citizens in a unitary state if Israel indeed wants to annex. But it doesn't. It keeps the Palestinians in this, I call it this quantum superposition of they're in land that Israel says is their land, but it's not formally annexed. So therefore they can be non-citizens within land that belongs to another country, even though they're native there. Okay, so just to fast forward, to breach this impasse, President George W. Bush, which compared to Donald Trump, actually now in retrospect seems more intelligent and more refined and sophisticated. Anyone who remembers him would never think they'd ever say that about him at the time. America tried to push for a resolution and a two-state solution. America does want a two-state solution. The problem is that Israel doesn't always play ball with the United States of America. Israel is useful to America as a forward, you could say, operating base, gathering intelligence, being used to project U.S. power in the region, in a strategic region. But Israel has its own ideas of the land it wants to be part of in its final form. And America doesn't care about the West Bank if it's in Israel's hands or the person's hands, per se. It just wants a stable and recognized, ally there to do its bidding in the region. But Israel wants that land, and so you'll find that despite the fact that the U.S. actually does push Israel to come to agreements and so on and so forth, it can't. Israel is not always complying with United States desires, and the United States can't push it too hard because it wants Israel as an ally. It has to support it and has to give it military funding every year. But it asks again for a phased withdrawal and a peace process. This is what the famous roadmap agreement. I'll let you read it for yourself, everyone, if you want to do further research. But the full Hafrada plan really comes into full swing during the time of Ariel Sharon, and of course Benjamin Netanyahu, as leader of the opposition at this point in time, also agrees with this. This was actually agreed by many policymakers in Israel, the idea of a separation of the Arabs and the Israelis, the non-Israeli Arabs. And they explain why. Here, Benjamin Netanyahu says, if there is a demographic problem, and there is, it is with the Israeli Arabs who will remain Israeli citizens. We therefore need a policy that will, first of all, guarantee a Jewish majority. So that's with just them being concerned with the birth rate of Israeli Arabs within Israel proper. But Ariel Sharon mentions, he says, the settlements which will be located are those which will be not included in the territory of the State of Israel in the framework of any possible future permanent agreement. And regarding them, at as part of the framework of the disengagement plan, Israel will strengthen its control over the same areas in the land of Israel, which will constitute an inseparable part of the land of Israel in any future agreement. So what he was talking about was he was going to remove settlements in Gaza and relocate them into West Bank to solidify the control of the West Bank, because no amount of settlements in the Gaza would ever solidify Israel's control in Gaza, because Gaza has, at that point in time, over 1 million Palestinians and only a 8,000, 9,000 Israeli settlements in Gaza at the time. But Ehud Olmert, right, Deputy Leader, Prime Minister, in an interview in 2003, now you can, I'm not going to read all this out, but I'll let you read it for yourself so you can see the quotation for yourself. But he argues that the problem facing the Zionist kind of project in Israel is a demographic one. They have to resolve the issue of keeping the Palestinians separate, as many of them as possible separate from Israelis, not for it to be a cause where they become merged into one state. And he mentions this here, he mentions here, if you look maybe eight lines down or more, he says that the problem here is that more and more Palestinians are uninterested in a negotiated two-state solution because they want to change the essence of the conflict from an Algerian paradigm to a South African one. So the Algerian paradigm is to remove settlers from your land, which obviously the Palestinians want. Many of them believed, but of course it seems very unlikely now. But what they fear is to change it into a South African paradigm. So what they want is they want the Palestinians who are not Israeli citizens in the West Bank and Gaza to not give up in a way their desire to use an Algerian paradigm to remove the settlers, all the settlers from the land, or to take back Palestine, because it is an unattainable goal, and it keeps Israel with possessing an excuse to treat them and keep them separate. But if they were to change it into a South African paradigm, this would be the worst thing ever, because as he points in this, if it becomes one man, one vote, they're the majority, that will be then the end of the Zionist project, because then it'll be one man, one vote, everyone has equal rights, and there's no way they could really fight against that politically in the global image of Israel, and they would lose like South Africa lost, and then that would be the end of the Zionist project, which is about Jews ruling the land. Not just Jews living in the land, but Jews must rule the land. That's the Zionist project. They have to have privilege in the sense of they must be the rule makers and control the power. So this is for you to read further. But this, then he talks about that in order to preclude this, they have to talk about a policy of unilateral, if you look at the bottom, unilateral separation. So keeping the Palestinians who are not Israelis separate, and therefore you preclude the need to talk about a one-state solution, as long as you, and even delay even having a dialogue with them for almost a quarter of a century, as you keep them in this zone you want them, which is that they want to remove you as a colonial entity, which they can't achieve, and you don't want them to call for that they'll become Israeli citizens. So you keep them in this nice little limbo zone while you further strengthen your grip on the West Bank, which you desire as a Zionist to increase the land. So the reason they left Gaza, and I will contend, and there's many evidences for this, is because if they didn't, the argument would be made that if Gaza is a small little strip, you have 8,000 Jews and over 1 million Palestinians, which are so closely intertwined. Why can't you just absorb them as citizens in the state? But if you withdraw from Gaza and build a wall around it, well, that's not a problem you have to think about, because it's a separate entity from us. Although we don't say we're occupying it, but it's a separate entity from the Israeli state. And of course, Ariel Sharon himself mentioned the disengagement plan from Gaza. He says the significance of the disengagement plan is the freezing of the peace process. I'll let you read the rest of that quote for yourself. But they are quite clear about the reasons for disengagement from Gaza. Zionists misrepresent that now. They say, oh, we gave you a state, we gave you land, and look how you repaid us. Say, no, that's not, you didn't give land because you blockaded it and controlled it, but from the Palestinians, but you still controlled it. You never let them be independent. Okay, so the disengagement plan is enacted in 2005. The withdrawal was enacted. Of course, elections occur, and in 2006, because Hamas wins those elections, who don't recognize Israel as legitimate nor its right to exist, they then impose sanctions against Gaza. Now, again, the Lebanon war, another invasion of Lebanon. This is where they say they're ostensibly out to remove Hezbollah. That fails. The Annapolis Conference, again, the United States wants to push to come to an agreement, to a mutual roadmap of withdrawal and the end of tensions, because the Israeli government is intractable. And it's not looking good for America's interests in the region. It doesn't want a vexatious Israeli state, but unfortunately, that's what that's the partner they get. The bombing of Gaza in 2012, there was flare-ups between, obviously, Hamas and the Israeli government. Now, we'll discuss this in the next part as to why these occur, but I'll just put it here for the point of historical information. We also see again, 2 years later, the bombing of Gaza again, Operation Protective Edge, quote unquote. Now, just 3 years ago, Trump peace plan. Also, this formatting is going a bit awry. The Trump peace plan, which is even more ridiculous than the Camp David plan. Again, no access to Jerusalem. Like basically, Jerusalem is just completely in the orbit of Israeli annexation, and some really strange kind of lumps of land given in the Negev, which is a wasteland, by the way, mostly on the bottom there. Of course, the Palestinians weren't interested into that. It was a ridiculous plan. They don't have. Oh, by the way, in all these proposals, just so everyone knows, it is taken as a given that the Palestinians are still not allowed control over their airspace. So their airspace is controlled by Israel, as well as not allowed to have a military. So they can't control their borders with Jordan, which is a key, because they don't have it's kept away. It's like, from Jordan with this buffer zone controlled by Israel to the west side of the River Jordan. So this is why no Palestinian who wants an independent state would ever agree to these proposals. Okay, and now this brings us to recent history, the last 3 years, where Bahrain, UAE, and Sudan and Morocco all normalized relations and agreed to recognize Israel. Now, this is done without any agreement with the Palestinians, without any let-up in the treatment of Palestinians, and Morocco has an issue with South Sahara, which America makes a deal to recognize Morocco's control over Western Sahara. Sorry, UAE wants fighter jets, and so that's the carrot that's offered to them. There's a number of geopolitical reasons for this, but it's got certainly nothing to do with giving the Palestinians back the West Bank or Gaza. 2021, and another bombing of Gaza again, and riots, which we can discuss in the next second part, you could say, where we discuss Zionist arguments, but just here for historical note. And this really brings us to the end of this kind of presentation. And I suppose I am kind of giving you a preview into the kind of things that we will be discussing in the second part, inshallah. So one of the key Zionist propaganda talking points is that the Arabs, or the Palestinians to be more specific, have been offered peace proposals repeatedly, and they always reject these peace proposals. And Israel is a country of peace, and it wants peace, and it's willing to give land for peace, and so on and so forth. But this rejects some surprising facts you might not be aware of, which is multiple factions of the Palestinians and the local Arab regimes have offered Israel peace repeatedly. And even when the United Nations itself together with these regimes, have again agreed on a peace proposal, Israel has consistently rejected the vast majority of peace proposals. And when I say the vast majority, as in of all the ones that, if you add together all the ones that Israel's made, those so-called peace plans, and all the ones that were made by others, the UN, the Arab states, the Palestinians, which are the vast majority of the peace proposals, Israel has rejected those. So the Arab Peace Initiative in 2002, which I already mentioned, which included the Organization of Islamic Conference, the OIC, endorsing the proposal. That includes Iran. But lesser known is also Hamas's peace proposals to Israel, which might be surprising. And I mention it here because it just challenges the Zionist narrative. And I think the Zionist narrative has to be challenged if it contradicts the facts. Because it's so, it might be a bit strange for you to hear this, so I decided to just give you screen captures of the news articles. You can see it in yourself. If you see at the bottom there, this is in 2006. Now, Hamas doesn't or can't give a formal recognition of Israel's right to exist according to its own principles. It can't give Israel an indefinite normalization, but it does the next best thing from at least its own principles to allow it, which is it kind of gives de facto recognition, if not de jure recognition to Israel. It offered that, as well as a 10-year truce, hudna, the term it was used, a type of treaty, similar to, you could say, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, right? 10 years, which can be renewed. And they're probably going to, the intent was to renew it indefinitely, I suppose, because their principles won't allow a normalization, which would be an indefinite treaty. So they offered that in 2006. They offered it in 2008 and said in return for the 1967 borders, they even said they'd even say they'd give implicit, they said that the treaty gives implicit proof of recognition of Israel. Because they said we can't say it literally, but we give it implicitly. And in 2012, Hamas leader was Ahmed Jabari, who was actually reviewing a draft. He was in kind of discussions with Israeli politicians to have a type of permanent truce with them in 2012. And in fact, he just received, according to this article, a draft of a permanent truce agreement with Israel, but he was then targeted for a targeted assassination by Israeli forces. I mean, you could have just said no, but and of course, in 2017, Hamas even changed their charter from the infamous 1988 one, declaring that they would, in essence, as they put it, as part of a national consensus initiative to recognize Israel within 1967 borders. So they stay on Israel proper and they on the West Bank on the Gaza. So they offered it again here. This is Hamas offering, of course, Netanyahu says Hamas is attempting to fool the world and then just says no to it. So a reason why I mention this, I want to be very clear, is that I mention this and I mention these cases because this clearly contradicts the Zionist narrative that they're the ones who have their peace proposals rebuffed, if you can call them that, whereas the peace proposals made by, agreed by the PLO, the Arab League, Iran, even Hamas, are regularly rebuffed by the Israeli state. Of course, if you want a bigger proposal than just those individuals, you can take as example the UN resolutions. It's basically almost every year there is a vote by the UN called the Peaceful Settlement of the Question of Palestine Resolution, and the members of the General Assembly, the nations around the world, vote to resolve the problem of the borders, and they all come to the same conclusion, including approved by the PLO, or the Palestine Authority now, acting as an observer member of the State of Palestine, approving this, approved by Iran, approved by Arab states, which again talk of a resolution within the 1967 borders: give the West Bank back, give Gaza back, and there will be a resolution, settlement, peace, recognition. And the vast majority of the nations on earth vote for it.
I mean, I'm just, where on earth is the Marshall Islands or the Marshall Islands? Well, where on earth are they? I mean, you got like the world superpower and the Marshall Islands, the two people. I mean, excuse me. I mean, I don't even know where they are. I mean,
or Palau.
Does anyone even live on these islands? I mean, Palau. I mean, exactly.
I thought Palau was a type of rice, but it's also
and Micronesia. I mean, whereas I mean, you know, these are like tiny little islands in the middle of nowhere, probably, and they have yippee. They have a vote. So, gosh.
Yes, I wonder who's given them the idea to vote the way they did.
I'm sure there wasn't any back channels giving Marshall Islands lots of money or trade deals or advantage. I'm sure there was no bribery involved at all.
Yeah, I'm sure these microstates wouldn't be intimidated at all by the United States.
Of course, America is a peace-loving nation, so there wouldn't have been any intimidation.
So now this was taken from Norman Finkelstein's book. He submitted a nice little table. It's called so basically, it was an inquest into the martyrdom of Gaza, and
it just shows how Israel and the US can hold the world hostage, basically, against the will of the global community. And it's in my view, it's a systemic error in the United Nations itself that two nations can systematically violate the will of the world for years and years and years. It's just the system is broken. It needs to change. But that's a different subject.
Yeah. So, like, I mean, this is not all the votes. There's votes since and so on, but which have pretty much gone in the same trajectory. But Norman Finkelstein, in his book Gaza: An Inquest into Its Martyrdom, put a nice little table. So I thought I would just nick it and put it into. It just conveys it very well. And this is, again, the peaceful settlement is recognized borders, recognized states, mutual recognition within those borders, and including the establishment of the State of Palestine. And of course, if you do want proof of this, this excerpt is taken as from the resolution, a statement made by the State of Palestine, which is, again, has a permanent observer status in the UN, but is not a formal member of the UN. That's been denied by the United States of America, of course, and by Israel. That they are agreeing and approve this resolution, just in case you want to dot the I and cross the T on that and make sure that, or do they actually approve that resolution themselves, because they can't vote on it because they're not a member of the General Assembly, but they do, they've endorsed it here formally. And it's included in the text of these resolutions itself. It's formal approval. So the Palestinian Authority formally approves of this and is willing to abide by that resolution. But this was made 2 years ago. I was actually wondering if they would ever go through with this, because this would be quite fascinating if they did. Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the Palestinian Authority, or the PLO, or Fatah, the Fatah faction, he got rather frustrated. He said it was probably one of his throwaway statements, but he said that if Israel does not withdraw from the occupied territories in the space of 1 year, obviously he didn't go through with this, but if they do not, he will go to the International Court of Justice to seek adjudication over the legitimacy of the occupation. But if that doesn't work out, then if he makes the possibility of a Palestinian state remote and it's not good and unlikely to ever happen, then they will change their approach, and that they will change their approach from instead having a separate state to, as he says, circumstances on the ground will inevitably impose equal and full political rights for all on the land of the historical Palestine within one state. To change it from an Algerian paradigm into a South African paradigm. So, all right, then if you're going to deny us our state, then give us citizenship, equal citizenship. If you say that you control the land, you own the land, West Bank belongs to you, Gaza belongs to you, Israel. If you say this, Israel, then you must give us citizenship and equal rights. Then, right? But of course, that is the ultimate nightmare of the Israeli Zionist side. And yes, this is the state of Palestine. For all those who want to know, like, it actually has a state. Yes, it does. And not only did it get was it recognized by the UN as a non-member observer state in 2012, but also it's been recognized as a state by 138 countries out of 193 member states in the United Nations. So they have recognized it as a state. Whether its lands, its borders haven't been formally defined is all. But
I assume what about I don't know. Does the European Union and the United States recognize Palestine as a state?
Well, no. The United States of America would not want to make Israel angry in recognizing.
And of course, and the EU or the Europe, does it recognize?
Well, you know what? If you want to check it for yourself, they don't. Well, most European countries do.
Okay.
Because
so much for recognizing the sovereignty of people and their right to self-determination. Then, okay.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's. Let me see if it's. I think. Yeah, so there's 27 states in the European Union. I think about only 8 or 9 of them recognize the state of Palestine as a state.
I bet Britain isn't one of them, but anyway.
Yeah, probably. Well, it regularly abstains from UN votes on.
Exactly. So the usual suspects probably don't recognize.
It abstains from such vote. Like it abstained on even the partition plan. It abstained on that too. From 1948, England, now it has divested itself of responsibility, can just abstain and say, well, we're not responsible anymore, so don't blame us for it. But that's it.
Oh yes, indeed, and yes, I must point out. Thank you very much. That you have a website. If you want to learn more about what Abdullah has covered, finding all the detailed references and source material, Abdullah will be producing an in-depth course on advocating for Palestinian rights and criticizing Zionism in the next few months. And to register, please visit the website address you can see in front of you, advocateforpalestine.com. And of course, this video is part 1 of a 2-part series. The second one will address the top 10 Zionist responses and accusations to criticisms and critics of the Zionist occupation of Palestine and its treatment of Palestinians. So that promises to be very juicy. So thank you very much indeed, Abdullah, for your outstanding detail. And it's very obviously you're trying to be precise and accurate and not give into hyperbole or rhetoric. You're giving the facts, really. And that's what really matters in this. So thank you very much.
A caveat to or any history buffs or anyone who's studied it, that there's I've glossed over a lot of things. There are so many details, points, events, because it is truly a massive topic covering. I mean, not just, you could say 100 years, but in theory, depending on.
And of course, since your slides, I mean, history has been made as we speak, terrible history. So it's ongoing. It's just getting worse, unfortunately.
Yeah, and as I said, like, all we can do is arm ourselves with knowledge, information, be aware, and it's with such a heavy heart that I feel very sad to have to add another slide on the bombardment of Gaza to the history record of teaching this course coming up, and that's it. But all we can do is arm ourselves with facts, and inshallah educate the public about this and not be fooled by the rhetoric and the kind of false argumentation of Zionists. And inshallah, in the next part, we will focus specifically on the top 10 Zionist arguments, used or popular or and or strong. I don't know if you can describe them as strong, because not really strong, but let's say the top 10 Zionism is used to criticize the Palestinian position or those who criticize them on their position.
Excellent. Well, I very much look forward to that. Thank you very much indeed again, Abdullah, and we will see you again, inshallah. So until then, take care. Bye.